Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history, where empresses who commanded armies, queens who ruled empires, and women who shaped the world have been carefully, deliberately erased. These are not stories of women who sat quietly beside thrones. These are stories of women who seized power, changed laws, defeated enemies, and terrified the men who later wrote their histories. And yet their names have almost vanished. Why? Because powerful women have always been dangerous to remember. Before we step into the gilded halls of Byzantium together, I need to ask you something. If you are drawn to stories that history tried to bury, stories about the women who were too powerful, too brilliant, too inconvenient to remember, then please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Give this video a like if you believe these women deserve to be remembered. And I am genuinely curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing that we are scattered across the world, but all gathering here in the quiet hours to uncover these hidden truths together. Now, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let us walk through the marble corridors of Constantinople, where the most powerful women in Roman history ruled, loved, betrayed, and were systematically erased from the pages of history. Constantinople. The year is 527. Imagine the greatest city on earth, a place where East meets West, where Roman tradition collides with Greek culture, where golden domes pierce the sky, and the scent of incense mingles with sea salt from the Bosphorus. This is the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Rome itself, and it is about to be ruled by a woman whose very existence would challenge everything the world thought it knew about power. Her name was Theodora, and here is what makes her story so extraordinary, so uncomfortable for the men who chronicled history. She was not born into royalty. She was not even born into respectability. Theodora entered this world around the year 497, the daughter of a bear keeper at the Hippodrome, the massive arena where Constantinople came to watch chariot races, wild animal shows, and theatrical performances. Her father, Acacius, worked with the bears and other animals that entertained the masses. When he died, Theodora's mother was left with 3 young daughters and no income, no protection, and no prospects in a society that offered women very few options, so Theodora became an actress. Now, we need to pause here and understand what that word meant in 6th century Byzantium. This was not Hollywood. This was not Broadway. Actresses in the Hippodrome were not respected artists. They were considered barely a step above prostitutes, performing bawdy comedies, acrobatic acts, and yes, often selling their bodies to survive. The historian Procopius, who would later become Theodora's most vicious critic, wrote in lurid detail about her performances, describing her as shameless, immoral, a woman who performed acts that would make even the most jaded Roman blush. But here is the thing about Procopius that we need to understand from the very beginning. He hated her. He feared her. And fear throughout history has always dressed itself up as moral outrage when it comes to powerful women. Procopius wrote 2 very different accounts of Theodora's life. In his public works, the ones that circulated during her lifetime, he praised her beauty, her charity, her intelligence. But in his secret history, a manuscript that was hidden away and only discovered centuries later, he unleashed every misogynistic fantasy, every bitter accusation he could summon. He called her a demon. He described her as insatiable, cruel, manipulative. He painted her as a monster. So which Theodora was real? Let us follow the evidence, not the anger of men who could not control her. Sometime in her late teens or early 20s, Theodora left Constantinople. She travelled to North Africa with a man named Cebulus, a government official who took her as his mistress. but the relationship soured, and Hysebulus abandoned her in a foreign land with nothing. This could have been the end of her story, a young woman alone, penniless in a strange city. But Theodora did something unexpected. Instead of trying to find another man to support her, she found herself. During her time in North Africa, Theodora underwent a profound spiritual transformation. She converted to Christianity, not the superficial conversion of convenience, but a deep, genuine faith that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. She travelled through Alexandria and Antioch, two of the great intellectual centres of the ancient world, and somewhere in those desert cities, the actress from the Hippodrome became something else entirely. She became a woman with a vision. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, she was changed. She lived quietly, supporting herself by spinning wool. And it was during this period of humility and reflection that she caught the attention of a man named Justinian. He was the nephew of the Emperor Justin, a rising star in Byzantine politics, and by all accounts, he was completely captivated by her. Not just by her legendary beauty, though sources agree she was stunning, with large, expressive eyes and a graceful presence that commanded attention, but by her mind, her intelligence, her understanding of politics, human nature and power. But there was a massive problem. Roman law, dating back to the time of Constantine, explicitly forbade senators from marrying actresses. The law was clear. Women of the theatre were considered so low, so tainted, that they could never marry into the senatorial class. Justinian was not just any senator. He was the heir apparent to the imperial throne, and he wanted to marry a former actress. This was scandal of the highest order. Justinian's aunt, the Empress Euphemia, was furious, and here is the delicious irony that makes this story so perfect. Euphemia herself was a former slave, possibly a former prostitute. She had risen to become empress, but now she used her position to block another woman's ascent. She forbade the marriage absolutely, so Justinian and Theodora waited. They lived together, loved together, and waited for Euphemia to die. She did in 523, and the moment she was gone, Justinian moved. He convinced his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law, not just to make an exception, but to completely overturn the prohibition against senators marrying actresses. The law was rewritten, and in 525, Justinian and Theodora were married in a ceremony that shocked Constantinople. The bearkeeper's daughter was now the wife of the heir to the throne. 2 years later, in 527, Emperor Justin died, and Justinian ascended to become Emperor of Byzantium. And on April 1st of that year, in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, Theodora was crowned empress not as a consort, not as a decorative figure, but as a co-ruler. Justinian insisted on it. He had her crowned with full imperial honours, with the regalia, the purple robes, the diadem. She was Augusta, the sacred and divine empress. And from that moment she wielded power that would have been unthinkable for a woman in almost any other period of history. So what did she do with that power? Let me tell you about January of 532, just 5 years into their reign. Constantinople erupted in violence. The Nika riots, named after the rebel cry of Nika, meaning cocker. It began as a protest by the two major political factions, the Blues and the Greens, but quickly spiraled into a full-scale revolution. The city burned. Thousands died. Rioters proclaimed a new emperor, and Justinian, the Emperor of Rome, was ready to flee. Picture the scene, the imperial palace surrounded by flames and screaming crowds, the streets running with blood, Justinian's advisors urging him to escape while he still could, to take ships and flee across the sea, to abandon Constantinople and save his life. The emperor was packing, he was preparing to run, and then Theodora spoke. We have her words, recorded by multiple sources, and they have echoed across 15 centuries. My lords, the present occasion is too serious to allow me to follow the convention that a woman should not speak in a man's council. Those whose interests are threatened by extreme danger should think only of the wisest course of action, not of conventions. In my opinion, flight is not the right course, even if it should bring us to safety. It is impossible for a person having been born into this world not to die, but for one who has reigned, it is intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be deprived of this purple robe, and may I never see the day when those who meet me do not call me Empress. If you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich. Over there is the sea, and yonder are the ships. Yet reflect for a moment whether, when you have once escaped to a place of security, you would not gladly exchange such safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that royalty is a good burial shroud. Royalty is a good burial shroud. In other words, I would rather die an empress than live as a refugee. The room fell silent. Justinian, shamed by his wife's courage, stayed. He ordered his general Belisarius to crush the rebellion. Belisarius herded 30,000 rioters into the Hippodrome, the same place where Theodora had once performed as a despised actress, and he slaughtered them. The rebellion was over, the empire was saved, and everyone knew it was Theodora's resolve that had made the difference. But her influence went far deeper than one dramatic moment. Theodora fundamentally reshaped Byzantine law, particularly laws concerning women. She passed legislation that prohibited the trafficking of young girls. She created shelters for former prostitutes, giving them refuge and the opportunity to build new lives. She changed divorce laws to give women more rights and protections. She fought against the sexual exploitation that she herself had experienced, using imperial power to dismantle systems of abuse. Now, Procopius has a different story about those shelters. In his secret history, he claims that the women hated the shelters so much that they threw themselves over the walls to escape. But other chroniclers, like John Malalas, tell us that Theodora freed these women from wretched slavery. John of Nikiu, an Egyptian bishop, wrote that she put an end to the prostitution of women and gave orders for their expulsion from every place of exploitation. Who do we believe? The man who called her a demon, or the multiple sources who documented her compassionate reforms? Theodora also played a crucial but complicated role in the religious controversies of her time. She was a devoted supporter of monophysitism, a Christian doctrine that believed Christ had only one divine nature, not two natures as Orthodox Christianity taught. This put her in direct opposition to her husband, who was the head of the Byzantine Church and defender of orthodoxy. And yet, Theodora used the great palace of Constantinople itself to shelter monophysite priests and monks, protecting them from persecution. She corresponded with foreign rulers, received ambassadors, and her name appeared on nearly every law passed during Justinian's reign. Many historians believe that she, not Justinian, was the true power behind the throne. The most beautiful representation of Theodora that survives is not a written description, but a mosaic. In the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, there is a 6th century mosaic that shows Theodora in full imperial regalia, surrounded by her attendants carrying a golden chalice. She wears purple robes embroidered with the 3 wise men offering gifts. Her face is serene, intelligent, powerful. She is depicted not as a consort, but as a ruler in her own right. It is one of the most stunning pieces of Byzantine art in existence, and it shows us how she wanted to be remembered, as an empress who earned her crown through intelligence, courage, and an unshakable will. Theodora died in 548, possibly from cancer or gangrene. She was only about 48 years old. Justinian was devastated. He never remarried. For the remaining 17 years of his life, he wore his grief like a cloak. And here is how we know how powerful she truly was. After Theodora's death, almost no significant legislation was passed for the rest of Justinian's reign. The reforms stopped. The energy of the empire dimmed. The woman who was supposed to be just decoration, just a pretty face beside the throne, turned out to be the engine that drove the entire Byzantine state. So why did history try to erase her? Why did Procopius write that venomous secret history, painting her as a scheming demon? Because she was everything a woman was not supposed to be. She was a woman from the absolute bottom of society who climbed to the absolute top. She was a woman who did not apologize, did not shrink, did not perform the meekness that powerful men expected. She made laws, she saved an empire, she ruled alongside her husband as an equal. And that was unforgivable. For centuries, the secret history was the text that scholars relied on when writing about Theodora. The lurid stories, the sexual scandals, the accusations of cruelty, that was what made it into the history books. But modern scholarship has started to peel back those layers of misogyny and ask harder questions. What if Procopius was lying? What if his secret history was not secret truth but secret revenge against a woman who had more power than he could ever dream of holding? What if Theodora was not the monster men painted her to be, but exactly what the evidence suggests? A brilliant, compassionate, strategic leader who used her power to help the most vulnerable people in her society. Tonight, we are reclaiming her. We are looking past the propaganda and seeing the woman who wore purple, who commanded respect, who changed laws to protect women and children, who stood firm when emperors trembled. Theodora of Byzantium was one of the most powerful women in history, and for too long, she has been remembered through the hateful eyes of men who could not stand to see a woman rise. But Theodora was not the only Byzantine empress whose story was buried. Just 2.5 centuries after Theodora's death, another woman would seize power in Constantinople. Her name was Irene of Athens, and she would do something even Theodora never dared. She would rule not as empress beside an emperor, but as emperor herself, the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and the world would lose its mind. That is where we are headed next, into the extraordinary, controversial reign of Irene, the woman who called herself not empress but emperor, and who would be vilified for centuries for daring to claim a title that belonged, everyone insisted, only to men. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been told you were too ambitious, too assertive, too unwilling to smile and stay quiet? If you are a woman, chances are the answer is yes. And if you have ever wondered where that double standard comes from, well, tonight you are going to meet one of its earliest and most tragic victims. Her name was Matilda. Not Empress Matilda of Byzantium, but a different Matilda entirely, an English princess who should have been England's first queen regnant, who fought a 19-year civil war for her throne, who commanded armies and ruled territories, and who was systematically written out of history as too haughty to deserve the crown that was rightfully hers. This is the story of how medieval England nearly had a ruling queen 400 years before they actually got one, and how the men of her time made absolutely sure that would never happen again. The year is 1102. England is still raw from the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror has been dead for 15 years, and his son Henry I sits on the throne. Henry is known to history as Henry Beauclerc, Henry the Scholar, though honestly, that name is doing a lot of heavy lifting. What Henry is really good at is survival, political manoeuvring and producing illegitimate children. In fact, Henry holds the record for the most acknowledged illegitimate children of any English monarch, at least 22 that we know of, but legitimate heirs. That is a different story. On a February day in 1102, Henry's wife, Queen Matilda of Scotland, yes, another Matilda because medieval England was apparently determined to confuse future historians, gives birth to a daughter. They name her Matilda, naturally. And for the first 8 years of her life, Princess Matilda grows up in the royal court as the precious, pampered daughter of the King of England. She learns to read and write in both Latin and Norman French. She is taught music, embroidery, the management of estates. Everything a royal daughter should know to become a valuable marriage pawn in the game of European politics. And then in 1110, when Matilda is only 8 years old, her father makes a decision that will change her life forever. He arranges for her to marry Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, not a prince, not a duke, the Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. And so at 8 years old, Matilda is sent away from her mother, away from England, across the sea to Germany to prepare for her future as Empress. Now pause and imagine this for a moment. You're 8 years old. You speak Norman French and some Latin, but you do not speak German. You are taken from your mother, whom you will never see again, as it turns out, because Queen Matilda of Scotland dies in 1118 while her daughter is still in Germany. You're placed in a foreign court surrounded by strangers, expected to learn a new language, new customs, new everything, all to prepare to marry a man you have never met. Most 8-year-old girls would collapse under that pressure, but the historian Catherine Hanley, who has written extensively about Matilda, says that this experience gave her a core of steel. She was not just decorative, she was not just a pretty face waiting in the background. She learned to survive, she learned politics, she learned power. In 1146, when Matilda was 12 years old, she married the emperor. She became Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, the highest-ranking woman in Western Christendom. And by all accounts, she was good at it. She travelled with her husband on military campaigns, she witnessed charters, she held court in his absence. She learned how to rule, how to command respect, how to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics. And then, in 1125, Emperor Henry died. Matilda was only 23 years old, childless and a widow. She could have stayed in Germany. She was beloved there. The German nobles offered to help her find another husband to keep her in the empire. But her father, King Henry of England, had other plans. He summoned her home, and here is where the story gets really interesting, because King Henry had a problem. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had died in 1120 in a shipwreck called the White Ship Disaster. Henry had all those illegitimate children, sure, but in medieval England only legitimate children could inherit the throne. He had no sons, he had only Matilda. So in 1127, King Henry did something unprecedented. He gathered all the greatest nobles of England and Normandy, bishops, earls, barons, and he made them swear an oath. Not just any oath, but a sacred, binding oath before God that they would accept Matilda as their ruler when Henry died, that they would support her claim to the throne, that they would acknowledge a woman as their sovereign. The oath was sworn, twice actually, because Henry was paranoid and made them do it again in 1131. Every major nobleman in England and Normandy promised, on their immortal souls, to accept Matilda as their queen. And then Henry tried to sweeten the deal by marrying Matilda off to Geoffrey of Anjou, a powerful French count who could provide military support and, hopefully, male heirs. There was just one small problem. Geoffrey was only 14 years old when they married. Matilda was 25. She was the Dowager Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman who had ruled alongside the most powerful man in Europe, and now she was being married to a teenager. Geoffrey was described as handsome, with reddish blonde hair and a habit of wearing a sprig of yellow broom flower in his hat, which is why his descendants would be called the Plantagenets, from the Latin plantagenista, broom plant. But handsome or not, he was a child and Matilda was not pleased. The marriage was rocky from the start. They separated. They reconciled. And finally, in 1133, Matilda gave birth to a son named Henry after his grandfather. Mission accomplished. The succession was secure. England would have a king even if his mother had to rule as regent for a while. Everything was falling into place. And then, on December 1st, 1135, King Henry I died. He had eaten a meal of lampreys, a kind of eel-like fish that he apparently loved despite his doctors warning him against it, and he died of food poisoning. The throne was empty. Matilda was the designated heir. Every noble had sworn to support her. This should have been straightforward. But here is the thing about medieval politics. Oaths sworn to women are apparently very, very easy to break. Because within weeks of Henry's death, Matilda's cousin Stephen of Blois rushed to London, seized the royal treasury and had himself crowned King of England. Stephen was charming, he was friendly, he was English-born, unlike Matilda, who had spent most of her life in Germany. And perhaps most importantly, he was a man. The nobles who had sworn those sacred oaths to support Matilda suddenly developed amnesia. They decided, conveniently, that actually, oaths sworn to a woman did not really count, or that Matilda was too foreign, or that her second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, was too ambitious, and obviously was just using her to seize the English throne for himself. Notice the pattern here. It is never that Matilda herself was unqualified, it was always something adjacent to her. She was too foreign, her husband was too ambitious. She was, as contemporary chronicles describe her, haughty. That word, haughty, appears again and again and again in the sources. Matilda was haughty, arrogant, proud, unwomanly. Now let me ask you this. What would they have called those same qualities in a man? Strong, decisive, commanding, fit to rule. But in a woman, haughty, unnatural, difficult. This is the linguistic game that has been played for 1,000 years to keep women out of power. You take the exact same behaviour, confidence, determination, refusal to bow and scrape, and you give it an ugly name when a woman does it. Matilda was furious, and she was not about to accept this theft quietly. In 1139, she landed in England with an army, and England plunged into civil war. For 19 years, the country was torn apart in a conflict historians call the Anarchy, and that name itself is interesting, is it not? When a man fights for his throne, it is a succession crisis, or a war of conquest. But when a woman fights for hers, it is the anarchy, as if the very idea of a female ruler was so contrary to natural order that it could only result in chaos. But Matilda was winning. In 1141, she captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. She had him imprisoned. She entered London in triumph. She was acknowledged as Lady of the English, not Queen notably, because the church refused to crown her, but the highest title they were willing to grant. She was on the verge of total victory. And then she made a mistake, or at least that is how the chroniclers tell it. She demanded money from the people of London to fund her government, which, to be fair, is what every medieval ruler did. Taxes were how kingdoms functioned. But the Londoners, egged on by Stephen's wife, another powerful woman named Matilda because of course, rose in rebellion. They drove Matilda out of London before she could be crowned. The moment was lost. And here is where the chronicles turn truly vicious. They say Matilda was swollen with insufferable pride, that she alienated the hearts of almost everyone with her arrogance, that she refused to listen to advice. But you know what is fascinating? When we look at the actual documented decisions Matilda made during her brief period of control, she was remarkably shrewd. She confirmed charters, she made strategic alliances, she was implementing the exact kind of governance her father had taught her, the exact kind of imperial administration she had learned in Germany, but she was doing it while female, and that apparently was unforgivable. The war dragged on, back and forth, victory and defeat, for years. Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, was her greatest military supporter, leading her armies while she focused on administration, diplomacy, securing alliances. This was smart. This was good leadership. But contemporary sources criticize her for not being on the battlefield herself, even though no male king was expected to personally fight every battle. The double standard was breathtaking. By 1148, Matilda was exhausted. She had been fighting for 9 years. Her half-brother Robert died that year, and without his military leadership, her position became untenable. She withdrew to Normandy, leaving her teenage son Henry to continue the fight. And in 1153, a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would acknowledge Matilda's son Henry as his heir. Stephen died in 1154, and Henry became King Henry II, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. So Matilda won, sort of. Her son became king. The throne she fought for stayed in her bloodline. But she never wore the crown herself. She never had the coronation, the acknowledgement, the title that was rightfully hers. And for the rest of her life she signed documents as Matilda Empress. Not Dowager Empress, not former Empress, just Empress. Because that was the highest title she ever officially held, and she clung to it like a lifeline. She also used the title Lady of the English, reminding everyone who bothered to remember that she had been, for a brief, shining moment, the acknowledged ruler of England. Matilda lived until 1167. She spent her final years in Normandy, and according to records, her son Henry II consulted her frequently on matters of state. She was his most trusted advisor. When he faced rebellions, political crises, questions about law and governance, he turned to his mother, the woman who had fought for 19 years and understood power in ways he was still learning. But history does not remember her that way. History remembers her, if at all, as the haughty woman who almost became queen, the woman who failed. Her epitaph, carved on her tomb in Rouen, tells you everything you need to know about how she was viewed. It reads, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring, here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." Do you see what that says? Nothing about her own achievements, nothing about the 19 years she fought for her throne. Nothing about her governance, her intelligence, her courage. She is remembered only in relation to the men in her life. Daughter of King Henry I, wife of Emperor Henry V, mother of King Henry II, her identity erased, her accomplishments forgotten, her legacy reduced to her womb. And here is the tragic coda to this story. England would not have another ruling queen for 400 years. When Mary I finally took the throne in 1553, she faced many of the same prejudices, the same accusations of being unnatural, the same insistence that women were unfit to rule. And people pointed to Matilda, to the anarchy, as proof that female rule led to chaos. They used her story as a cautionary tale, conveniently forgetting that the chaos was caused not by Matilda's gender, but by men who broke their sacred oaths because they could not stomach the idea of bowing to a woman. What would have happened if Matilda had been crowned? What would have changed in English history, in European history, if the precedent of a ruling queen had been set in 1141 instead of 1553? Would Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda's daughter-in-law, have been able to wield even more overt power? Would the path have been smoother for the extraordinary women who came after? We will never know, because the men of medieval England made absolutely certain that Matilda's moment was extinguished before it could inspire others. But Matilda's fight was not in vain, even if she never got the acknowledgement she deserved. Because while England was busy erasing one powerful woman from its history, Scotland was doing something very different. Scotland was creating saints out of their queens, building legends, preserving stories, and in the misty highlands and lowland abbeys, there were women whose names have almost vanished, but whose impact shaped a nation. Let me tell you about the Scottish queens that time forgot, and why their stories matter just as much as any king who ever wore a crown. Scotland in the Middle Ages was a land of contradictions, brutal and beautiful, savage and sacred, a place where Viking raiders met Celtic Christianity, where ancient stone circles stood beside newly built abbeys, where queens could become saints but princesses could be caged like animals. And tonight, I want to tell you about 3 Scottish royal women whose stories have been buried under centuries of romanticised Highland legends and focus on their famous men. These women shaped a nation, changed the course of history, and were systematically forgotten because their husbands and sons were more convenient to remember. Let us start with a woman who was declared a saint, yet even sainthood could not protect her story from being reduced to a footnote. Her name was Margaret, and she was born around 1045 in the Kingdom of Hungary, which seems like an odd place for a future Queen of Scotland to begin her life. But Margaret was not Hungarian. She was English, descended directly from the Anglo-Saxon royal family, the granddaughter of King Edmund Ironside. Her family had fled England and lived in exile in Hungary during the Danish conquest. So Margaret grew up speaking multiple languages, educated in the European style, deeply religious, and entirely disconnected from the land she would one day rule. In 1057, when Margaret was about 12 years old, her family was finally able to return to England. Edward the Confessor, the childless king, wanted to secure the succession, and Margaret's father was a potential heir. But then her father died suddenly, mysteriously, within days of arriving in England. Convenient, is it not? And then, in 10 nicks, everything fell apart. William of Normandy invaded. The Battle of Hastings, the Norman conquest. The Anglo-Saxon royal family was finished, and Margaret, now about 21 years old, had to flee again, this time with her mother and siblings, escaping the Norman armies that were hunting down anyone with a claim to the English throne. Their ship was heading for the European continent, but a storm drove them north, and they were shipwrecked on the coast of Scotland. Think about that for a moment. Margaret had already been exiled once as a child. She had just lost her homeland for a second time. She was a refugee, washed up on a foreign shore, with nothing but her family, her education, and her faith. And the man who found her was Malcolm III, King of Scots, known as Malcolm Canmore, Malcolm Big Head. He was a warrior king, rough, powerful, everything Margaret was not. He was in his mid-30s, a widower, and according to legend, he took one look at this educated, pious, beautiful refugee princess and decided he had to marry her. They married around 1070, and it should have been a disaster. Malcolm spoke Gaelic. Margaret spoke English, French and Latin, but not Gaelic. He was a warrior who spent half his time raiding northern England. She was a contemplative intellectual who spent hours in prayer. But somehow, against all odds, it worked. And Margaret did not just become a decorative queen, she transformed Scotland. Here is what the chronicles tell us. Margaret introduced continental religious practices to Scotland, bringing the Scottish Church in line with Rome. She established Benedictine monasteries. She reformed church liturgy. She founded the famous ferry crossing across the Firth of Forth, which is still called Queen's Ferry in her honour. But beyond the religious reforms, Margaret did something that was radical for her time. She served food to orphans with her own hands. She washed the feet of the poor every single day. There is a cave on the banks of the Tower Burn in Dunfermline where she would go to pray in solitude, and you can still visit it today. It is called St. Margaret's Cave. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like typical medieval hagiography, right? The stories of saints always involve serving the poor and performing miracles and being impossibly virtuous. But here is the thing. Multiple independent sources confirm these details about Margaret. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentioned her. Scottish church records document her reforms, and her own confessor and biographer, a monk named Turgot, wrote an account of her life that, while certainly worshipful, includes specific, verifiable details about her political influence and intellectual capacity. Turgot describes how Margaret would debate theology with Malcolm, who could not read Latin but was curious about her learning. She would explain scripture to him, and he would listen, genuinely fascinated. She calmed what one chronicler called his pagan temperaments, which is probably medieval code for she convinced this Viking-descended warrior to stop pillaging quite so enthusiastically. She had 6 sons and 2 daughters with Malcolm, and she educated all of them personally, ensuring they were literate, pious, and prepared to rule. And then, in November of 1093, tragedy struck with devastating speed. Malcolm and their eldest son Edward were killed at the Battle of Alnwick, fighting against the English. Margaret was already ill, possibly dying, when the news reached her. According to Turgot, she was at Edinburgh Castle, so sick she could barely move, when her son Edgar came to her. She asked him tebeckley, "How fare the king and thy brother?" Edgar could not lie to his dying mother. He told her the truth, both dead, and Margaret, who had already been on her deathbed, died 3 days later. Of grief, say of her illness, perhaps both. She was buried at Dunfermline Abbey in a ceremony that reflected the love the Scottish people had for her. She was not just mourned as a queen, but as a mother of the nation. In 1250, Pope Innocent IV canonised her as St. Margaret of Scotland. She became one of only 2 Scottish saints ever canonised by the Catholic Church. Her feast day is November 16th. She was held up for generations as the very pinnacle of what a queen should be. Pious, charitable, devoted to her husband, mother of kings. But here is where it gets strange. Here is where the erasure begins. Because despite being a canonised saint, despite founding institutions that still exist, despite shaping Scottish Christianity, Margaret's actual body became scattered across Europe like religious souvenirs, and nobody is quite sure where all of her is anymore. After her burial at Dunfermline, her head was removed and taken to Edinburgh as a holy relic. Then, during the chaos of the Reformation, when Protestant reformers were destroying Catholic relics, her head ended up in France. And then it was lost during the French Revolution. Gone, just gone. Other parts of her body were transferred to Spain by King Philip II, who collected saints' relics the way some people collect stamps. In 1862, a Scottish Catholic bishop went to Spain and managed to get back what was supposedly a piece of Margaret's shoulder bone, which is now at St. Margaret's Church in Dunfermline. But the rest? Scattered, lost, a saint in pieces, and even her tomb at Dunfermline is probably empty. When Queen Victoria paid to restore it in the 1800s, it was most likely restoring a cenotaph, an empty memorial, not an actual grave. So here is the bitter irony. Scotland made Margaret a saint, but could not keep her body intact. They venerated her memory, but could not preserve her physical remains. She became a symbol, an ideal, a story, but the actual woman, fragmented and forgotten. Now let us talk about Princess Marjorie Bruce, because if Margaret's story is about being elevated to impossible sainthood, Marjorie's story is about being used as a political weapon and then erased from the narrative of her own father's triumph. Marjorie was born around 1296, the daughter of Robert the Bruce, the most famous Scottish king in history. You know his name even if you know nothing else about Scottish history. Robert the Bruce, the spider in the cave, the hero who won independence from England, national icon, symbol of Scottish freedom. But Marjorie, his daughter, most people have never heard of her. She was about 10 years old when her father had himself crowned King of Scots on March 27, 1306, claiming the throne in defiance of English rule. And immediately King Edward I of England, Longshanks, the man they called the Hammer of the Scots, came down on the Bruce family with terrifying vengeance. Robert's plan was to send the women of his family to Norway for safety. His wife, his daughter Marjorie, his sisters, they would flee to the north while Robert fought. But they never made it. They were captured at Kildrummie Castle in Aberdeenshire. Robert's brother Neil defended the castle as long as he could, giving the women time to flee, but they were caught by the Earl of Ross, a Scottish noble loyal to England. Now, here is a detail that will make your blood run cold. The women sought sanctuary in a chapel. Do you know what sanctuary meant in medieval times? It meant that once you entered a holy place, you were under God's protection. No one could legally touch you. It was one of the most sacred laws of Christendom. The Earl of Ross violated sanctuary. He arrested them right out of the chapel and handed them over to King Edward. And Edward, furious at Robert the Bruce's rebellion, decided to make an example out of these women to show the price of rebellion. Robert's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, was Edward's own goddaughter, so she was treated relatively gently, locked in comfortable house arrest. But Marjorie, she was 10 years old, a child, and Edward ordered her imprisoned in a cage, not a cell, a cage, specifically built for her, placed in the Tower of London where people could see her. She was put on display like an animal, a living warning to anyone who dared rebel against English rule. Do you understand how psychologically devastating that is? A 10-year-old girl taken from her family, caged, exhibited. The chronicler Erin Lawless writes that Edward refused to execute the women, but believed they should illustrate the full price of rebellion. Marjorie was his illustration. She was in that cage for about 4 years. 4 years of her childhood, stolen, traumatized, turned into propaganda. And when she was finally released, around 1314 after Robert the Bruce's great victory at Bannockburn, she was a teenager who had spent her formative years as a prisoner of war. Marjorie married Walter Stewart in 1315, and in 1316 she was pregnant with her first child. According to legend, she was riding a horse when it threw her, and she went into premature labour. She gave birth to a son, but she died from the injuries, possibly from internal bleeding or complications from the fall. She was only about 20 years old. Her son Robert survived, and that son would eventually become King Robert II of Scotland, founding the Stuart dynasty that would rule Scotland for over 3 centuries and eventually inherit the English throne as well. So here is the legacy. Marjorie Bruce, the child who was caged and displayed like a zoo animal, became the direct ancestor of the Stuart kings, including Mary Queen of Scots and King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Without Marjorie, there is no Stuart dynasty. Without Marjorie, the entire royal lineage changes. But how often do you hear her name? How often is she mentioned when we talk about Robert the Bruce? She is a footnote, a sad aside. Oh, and his daughter was imprisoned. But anyway, back to Robert's military genius. The violence done to Marjorie was not just physical, it was historical. She was used as a tool of terror, survived it, gave birth to a dynasty, and then was written out of the story as if her suffering and her survival did not matter. as if she was just a vessel for the son who would become king, not a person with her own trauma, her own strength, her own story. And then there is the third Scottish queen I want you to meet tonight, and she is the one who hides in plain sight. Her name was Edith of Dunfermline, but you probably know her, if you know her at all, as Queen Matilda, wife of King Henry I of England. Yes, another Matilda. And yes, this gets confusing, but stay with me because Edith, who became Matilda, is the woman immortalised in one of the most famous nursery rhymes in the English language, and I would bet money you have sung about her without knowing it. Edith was born around 1080, the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and St. Margaret. So she was a Scottish princess, daughter of a saint, raised in profound piety and royal expectation. But when her father and oldest brother were killed at Alnwick, and her mother died of grief, Edith's world collapsed. She was sent to a convent in England for her education and safety, and here is where things get complicated, because there were rumours that Edith had taken the veil, that she had become a nun, which would have made her ineligible for marriage. When King Henry I of England wanted to marry her in 1100, there was a scandal. Could he marry a woman who might be a professed nun? Council of Bishops was convened to investigate. Edith herself testified that she had never taken vows, that she had worn a veil only to protect herself from unwanted attention, which frankly is heartbreaking if you think about it. A young girl in a convent, forced to pretend to be a nun just to keep powerful men from assaulting her. The bishops decided she was free to marry, and on November 11th, 1100, Edith married King Henry and was rechristened Matilda, a more Norman appropriate name for a Norman queen. And here is the thing that history loves to skip over. Matilda was mocked, ruthlessly. She and Henry were both criticised for their complete lack of interest in fashionable Norman culture. They did not care about fancy hairstyles or elaborate parties. Matilda continued her mother's practices. She wore hair shirts, washed the feet of the poor, founded leper hospitals, lived simply, and the Norman court thought she was bizarre. They called her old-fashioned, prudish, too Scottish, too Anglo-Saxon, not glamorous enough. But Matilda did not care. She built bridges, literally. She loved architecture and engineering, and she commissioned the building of bridges across England. She rebuilt London Bridge, commissioned public baths, funded hospitals, and this is where the nursery rhyme comes in. You know how it goes? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. Scholars believe, my fair lady is Queen Matilda. The rhyme is about her love of building and rebuilding bridges, about her legacy as a builder. You have been singing about a Scottish queen your entire life and did not even know it. Matilda died in her 30s around 1118, possibly from childbirth complications or illness, and she is remembered, if at all, as the first wife of Henry I, mother of Empress Matilda, whom we talked about earlier, and the subject of a children's song. Not as a reformer, not as a builder, not as a woman who carried on her mother's legacy of charity and compassion, just my fair lady in a nursery rhyme that most people do not even know is about a real person. Do you see the pattern forming? Margaret becomes a saint, and her body is scattered, until nobody knows where she is buried. Marjorie survives being caged and displayed, gives birth to a dynasty, and is reduced to a tragic footnote. Matilda builds bridges and hospitals, lives a life of service, and becomes a nursery rhyme. These women shaped Scotland. They shaped England. They founded dynasties, reformed churches, survived unimaginable trauma. And yet when we learn history, we learn about their fathers, their husbands, their sons. Malcolm Canmore, Robert the Bruce, King Henry I, the men get the stories, The women get the margins, but tonight we are reclaiming those margins. We are saying their names: Margaret, Marjorie, Matilda. And we are asking the question that should make us all uncomfortable. How many other women have we forgotten? How many other queens? How many other leaders? How many other brilliant, courageous, powerful women have been erased because it was easier to remember the men? The answer, as we are about to discover, is staggering. Because while Scotland was busy turning queens into saints and footnotes, across the ocean and down the African continent, there were women commanding armies, negotiating with empires, and fighting battles that would make any European king jealous. Women whose names should be taught in every history class on Earth. Women who were too powerful, too strategic, too inconvenient for colonial historians to acknowledge. Let me introduce you to Queen Nzinga, and prepare yourself because this is where the story gets even more intense. Picture this: it is 1622, and in a room in Luanda, on the coast of what is now Angola, one of the most iconic moments in diplomatic history is about to unfold. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, is waiting to receive an ambassador from the Kingdom of Ndongo. This ambassador has been sent to negotiate a peace treaty, to discuss the slave trade, to navigate the treacherous waters of European colonialism that are flooding into West Central Africa. The governor has prepared his throne, his seat of power. And when the ambassador enters, he notices something immediately. There is only one chair in the room. His. This is deliberate. This is a power move. By forcing the ambassador to stand while he sits, the governor is establishing dominance, showing who is in control of this negotiation. But the ambassador is not a man. The ambassador is a woman. Her name is Nzinga Mbande, and she is about to teach this Portuguese governor a lesson in power that will echo across 4 centuries. Nzinga surveys the room, she sees the chair, she understands exactly what is happening, and without hesitation, without a flicker of uncertainty, she gestures to one of her attendants. The woman immediately drops to her hands and knees, and Nzinga sits on her back as if she were a throne. She conducts the entire negotiation from this human chair, looking the governor directly in the eye, speaking as an equal, refusing to be diminished. Can you imagine the shock in that room? The Portuguese governor, who thought he had orchestrated a humiliation, suddenly facing a woman who turned his own game against him with one elegant, devastating gesture. This is how Nzinga announced herself to the colonial powers of Europe. I will not bow, I will not beg. I will meet you as an equal, and if you try to put me beneath you, I will find a way to rise. That moment tells you everything you need to know about Queen Nzinga. But what history has failed to tell you is everything else. Who was she before that meeting? How did a woman in 17th century Africa gain the political and military skills to fight the Portuguese Empire for 40 years? And why has her story been so thoroughly distorted, dismissed, and erased by the very colonial sources that are our main records of her life? Nzinga was born around 1583 in the Kingdom of Ndongo, in the region that the Portuguese would later name Angola. Her father was King Quilombo Kia Kasenda, the Ngola, which is where the name Angola comes from. The word Angola was the title of the ruler, and the Portuguese just turned it into the name of the territory they were colonizing. So even the name of the country is a reminder of stolen sovereignty. Nzinga had a brother, Mbandi, who was the heir, and 2 sisters, Kifunji and Mukambu. And here is where Nzinga's story diverges from every other princess we have talked about tonight. Her father did not send her away to marry some foreign prince. He did not lock her in a convent. He saw her intelligence, her strategic mind, and he did something radical. He let her attend political councils. She sat in on meetings that were supposed to be for men only. She learned statecraft, diplomacy, military strategy, not as decoration but as a participant. This was unusual, but not unheard of in the Mbundu culture. Women could hold power. There was a tradition of influential queen mothers and female advisors. But Nzinga was being groomed for something more, and she needed those skills desperately, because by the time she was a young woman, the Portuguese were not just trading on the coast anymore. They were pushing inland. They wanted slaves, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The Atlantic slave trade was ramping up to industrial scale, and Ndongo was right in the crosshairs. When Nzinga's father died, her brother Mbandi became king, and Mbandi was, by all accounts, a disaster. He was paranoid, cruel, incompetent. Terrified that Nzinga might challenge him, he reportedly had her son killed. Yes, Nzinga had at least one child, possibly more, and her brother murdered them to eliminate potential rivals. He also had her sister's children killed. This was a man so consumed by fear and inadequacy that he destroyed his own family. And while he was busy with his internal paranoia, the Portuguese were increasing their demands. More slaves, more concessions, more land. Mbandi was losing control, and everyone knew it. So in 1622, facing a potential war with Portugal that he could not win, Mbandi made a desperate decision. He sent his sister Nzinga as his ambassador to negotiate with the Portuguese. This was the negotiation where Nzinga used her attendant as a chair. And during those talks, she did something else that was equally strategic. She converted to Christianity. She was baptized and took the name Ana de Souza, named after the governor's wife, who became her godmother. Now some historians have portrayed this as cynical manipulation, a calculated move to gain Portuguese favour. But others argue that Nzinga, like many African rulers of her time, saw Christianity as a way to access European networks, to gain legitimacy in European eyes, and to protect her people from being classified as pagans who could be enslaved without moral qualms. The negotiations resulted in a treaty. The Portuguese agreed to withdraw from Ndongo's territory and return to the coast. In exchange, Nzinga agreed to facilitate some level of trade. It seemed like a diplomatic victory, but the Portuguese never honoured that treaty. They never withdrew. They kept pushing, kept demanding, kept enslaving. And in 1626, Nzinga's brother Mbandi died. Some sources say suicide, some say poison. Some whisper that Nzinga herself might have been involved, though there is no solid evidence. What we do know is that Nzinga assumed power, declaring herself Queen of Ndongo in 1624, and immediately the Portuguese refused to recognise her authority. Here is where the colonial sources become a problem. Almost everything we know about Nzinga comes from Portuguese records and Capuchin missionary accounts. These were written by men who were actively trying to justify colonization, who needed to paint African rulers as barbaric, savage, illegitimate. So when you read about Nzinga in these sources, you get wild, lurid stories designed to shock European readers. They claim she was bloodthirsty, that she kept a harem of men dressed as women, that she participated in cannibalistic rituals, that she was a monster. But here is what modern historians like Linda Haywood, who wrote the definitive biography Ninga of Angola, Africa's warrior queen, have discovered when they actually analyse these sources critically. Much of it is either exaggerated, taken out of context, or outright fabricated. Yes, Nzinga allied with the Imbangala, a fierce warrior society that had initiation rites involving ritual bloodshed. Yes, she adopted some of their practices to gain their military support. But the colonial chroniclers took these cultural practices, filtered them through their own racist and sexist assumptions, and turned Nzinga into a gothic horror story to make Portuguese invasion seem like a moral crusade. What the evidence actually shows is this. Nzinga was a brilliant military strategist who understood that she could not defeat the Portuguese in conventional warfare. They had firearms, they had fortified positions, they had alliances with some African kingdoms who were profiting from the slave trade. So Nzinga did what great commanders have always done when facing a superior force. She innovated. She waged guerrilla warfare. She built alliances. She played European powers against each other. When the Portuguese refused to recognize her as queen, she conquered the neighbouring kingdom of Matamba in 1631 and made herself queen there instead. Matamba had a long tradition of female rulers, so her legitimacy was unquestioned, and from that base she built an army. In 1641, Nzinga did something extraordinary. She formed an alliance with the Dutch, who were also trying to establish a foothold in the region and were rivals to the Portuguese. This was one of the earliest African-European alliances against another European power. Think about the diplomatic skill that required. Nzinga was negotiating with people who spoke different languages, had completely different cultural frameworks, different religions, different strategic goals, and she managed to convince the Dutch that supporting her was in their interest. Together they captured the Portuguese fort at Massangano in 1647. It was a stunning victory, but then the Dutch were defeated by a Portuguese counterattack in 1648, and they withdrew from the region entirely, leaving Nzinga on her own again. A lesser leader would have surrendered, would have negotiated for exile, for safety, for survival, not Nzinga. She retreated to Matamba and kept fighting. She led her own troops into battle well into her 60s. Can you picture that? A woman in her 60s in the 17th century, personally commanding armies in the African interior, fighting against one of the most powerful colonial empires in the world. And here is one of the most fascinating aspects of Nzinga's reign. At some point in the 1640s, she made a decision to live as a man. This is documented in Portuguese sources, and has led to all kinds of interpretations. Some modern scholars see it as evidence of Nzinga being gender non-conforming or transgender. Others see it as a political strategy. In the region, there was historical precedent for female rulers of Congo declaring themselves men, dressing in male clothing and engaging in polyandry, having multiple husbands, as a way to claim masculine political authority in a patriarchal system. Portuguese sources claim Nzinga forced her husbands to dress as women, which sounds shocking until you understand it within the context of her claiming male royal authority. She was essentially saying, I am not a queen consort. I am not a woman who rules through a man. I am the ruler. I hold the masculine power, and everyone in my court will acknowledge that. Was this liberating? Was it oppressive? Was it strategic? Probably all three. Nzinga was operating in a world that did not have space for female authority. So she created that space by redefining gender itself within her kingdom. It is messy. It is complicated. It does not fit into neat modern categories. And that is exactly why her story is so important. She was not a symbol. She was a real person navigating impossible circumstances with whatever tools she had. In 1656, after decades of warfare, Nzinga finally signed a peace treaty with the Portuguese. She was in her 70s by then. The treaty was not a surrender. It was a negotiated settlement between two powers who were both exhausted. And in that treaty, the Portuguese finally, formally, recognized Nzinga as Queen of Ndongo and Matamba. After 40 years of fighting, she got the recognition she had demanded in that room in 1622. She had won, not total victory, but something perhaps more important, legitimacy, survival. The preservation of her kingdom's autonomy, at least for her lifetime. Nzinga died on December 17, 1663. She was about 80 years old. She had ruled for nearly 4 decades, through war and plague and famine and betrayal. And despite repeated Portuguese attempts to capture or kill her, she died peacefully, in her own kingdom, on her own terms. Her sister Barbara succeeded her and ruled until 1606, continuing Nzinga's policies. But after that, Portuguese colonial pressure intensified, and eventually Angola fell completely under colonial control. So what is Nzinga's legacy? In Angola, she is a national hero. There is a statue of her in Luanda, in Kinaxixi Square, showing her in full warrior regalia. Streets, schools and institutions are named after her. She is the symbol of Angolan resistance, courage, independence. But outside of Angola, outside of Africa, how many people know her name? When we teach world history, we talk about European exploration, European conquest, European civilization. We learn about Portuguese explorers and Spanish conquistadors and British Empire builders, but we do not learn about the African leaders who fought them, who resisted them, who negotiated with them as equals. And when Nzinga is mentioned in Western sources, it is almost always through the lens of those colonial chronicles. The bloodthirsty queen, the savage warrior, the exotic curiosity. Even well-meaning accounts often focus on the sensational aspects, the human chair, the gender bending, the alleged brutality, rather than on her actual political achievements, her diplomatic genius, her military innovations, her 40 years of successful resistance against one of the most powerful empires on Earth. There is a Netflix documentary series from 2023 called African Queens Njinga that attempts to tell her story more fully. There are academic works, like Linda Hayward's biography, that are reclaiming Nzinga from the colonial narratives. But these are recent. For centuries, Nzinga was either unknown or misrepresented, and that erasure was not accidental. Colonial powers needed Africans to be seen as primitive, as lacking in political sophistication, as needing European civilization. A queen like Nzinga, who spoke Portuguese fluently, who wrote diplomatic letters, who negotiated treaties, who built alliances, who commanded armies, she destroyed that narrative. So she had to be painted as an exception, as an aberration, as a monster rather than a leader. But Nzinga was not an exception. She was part of a long tradition of powerful African queens and female rulers, and one of the most frustrating aspects of studying African history is realizing how many of these women have been erased, how many stories have been lost, how many leaders have been reduced to footnotes or forgotten entirely because European chroniclers either did not care to record them or actively worked to diminish them. Take the Kandaks, for instance. Do you know that word? Probably not, unless you are a specialist in ancient African history, but you should, because the Kanda case were the queen mothers of the Kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan, and they ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Africa for centuries. These were women who built pyramids, commanded armies, and went to war against Rome itself, and yet most people have never heard of them. Let me tell you about a queen who made the Roman Empire retreat, who negotiated with Caesar Augustus as an equal, and whose story should be as famous as Cleopatra's but has been buried under centuries of willful ignorance. Her name was Amanirenas, and she was a warrior queen who refused to bow to Rome. There is a reason why Cleopatra is a household name, but Kandake Amanirenas is not, and that reason has everything to do with who gets to write history, who gets to decide which stories matter, and which powerful women are allowed to be remembered. Both women ruled in Northeast Africa around the same time. Both commanded armies. Both negotiated with Rome. Both left behind archaeological evidence of their power carved in stone. But one became a legend immortalized in Shakespeare and Hollywood, while the other has been buried so thoroughly in historical obscurity that most people have never even heard the word Kandak. So let me fix that right now. The Kandaks were the queen mothers of the Kingdom of Kush, which flourished in what is now Sudan from around 1070 BC to 350 CE. That is 1400 years of civilization, of continuous culture, of building pyramids and temples and cities along the Nile. And during several periods of that long history, the Kandakes did not just advise kings, they ruled. They were queens regnant, monarchs in their own right, with absolute power over one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Africa. And the most famous of these warrior queens, the one who should be as celebrated as any military leader in ancient history, was Amanirenas. The year is 27 BCE. Rome has just transitioned from republic to empire. Augustus Caesar is consolidating his power, expanding Roman territory, bringing the known world under his control. Egypt, which had been ruled by Cleopatra and Mark Antony, has fallen. It is now a Roman province, and Rome's border with Kush suddenly becomes a flashpoint. The Romans, drunk on conquest and convinced of their own invincibility, start pushing south. They raid Kushite territory, they seize land. They probably assumed that this African kingdom would roll over the way so many others had. They were catastrophically wrong, because the ruler they were facing was Kandake Amanirenas, and she was not interested in submission. Ancient hieroglyphics describe her as a warrior queen, a military strategist, a leader who personally commanded her forces in battle. And here is a detail that sends chills down my spine. She was blind in one eye. We know this because archaeologists found her remains, and the skull shows evidence of trauma that would have destroyed her left eye. Some scholars believe she lost it in battle. Can you imagine? A one-eyed queen leading armies against the Roman Empire. That is not a fairy tale. That is not mythology. That is documented history. In 27 BC, when the Romans attacked, Amanirenas struck back with devastating force. She led an army north into Roman-controlled Egypt, sacked the city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, and pushed all the way to Philae. Her forces tore down statues of Augustus, and in one of the most symbolic acts of defiance in ancient history, they beheaded a bronze statue of the emperor himself. That head was taken back to Kush and buried under the steps of a temple, so that every person who entered would literally walk on the face of Rome's most powerful man. Archaeologists found that bronze head in 1910, still buried where Amanirenas' people had placed it 2,000 years earlier. It is now in the British Museum, because of course it is. Even in defeat, even in archaeological discovery, African artifacts end up in European museums. Rome, predictably, was furious. Augustus sent the Roman governor of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, south with legions to crush this rebellion. And there is a Roman historian, Strabo, who wrote about this conflict. He describes the Kushites as formidable opponents, skilled warriors, and he mentions their queen, though he gets her title wrong, calling her Candace instead of Kandake. The Romans thought Candace was her name. It was her title, Queen Mother, Kandake. But this mistake tells you something important. The Romans did not understand the power structure they were facing. They did not comprehend that in Kush, women could hold the highest political and military authority. The war went back and forth. The Romans would capture a city. The Kushites would take it back. There were sieges, battles, skirmishes, and then something remarkable happened. In 21 or 20 BCE, Kandake Amanirenas sent ambassadors to meet with Augustus Caesar himself to negotiate a peace treaty, not to surrender, to negotiate as equals, and the treaty they signed was shockingly favourable to Kush. Rome agreed to withdraw from Kushite territory. They established a clear border and agreed not to push south anymore. Kush would not pay tribute to Rome. They would remain independent, sovereign, free. Do you understand how rare that was? Rome was conquering everybody: Egypt, Gaul, Britannia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. But they signed a peace treaty with Kush that essentially said, "We will leave you alone." And that treaty held. For centuries, Rome and Kush maintained a peaceful border, trading partners instead of enemies. Amanirenas had done what almost no other leader of her era managed to do. She fought Rome and won. Not total annihilation, but something better: recognition, respect and peace on her terms. And yet, where is her history? Why do we learn about Julius Caesar and Augustus and Nero, but not about the one-eyed queen who made Rome back down? The answer is painfully simple. She was African, she was a woman, and the people who wrote the history books for the next 2,000 years were European men who were not particularly interested in celebrating African female military genius. Amanirenas was not the only Kandake. She was the second of at least 8 queen mothers who ruled Kush over the centuries. There was Bartara and Nawidamak and Malakorabar and Amanikatashan. These women built temples. They commissioned pyramids. Yes, Kush had pyramids. More than Egypt, actually, though they are smaller. They minted coins with their own faces on them, showing them wearing elaborate jewellery and royal regalia. They left behind inscriptions in Meroitic script, the written language of Kush that we still have not fully deciphered. These were not primitive tribal leaders. These were sophisticated monarchs ruling a complex, literate, urbanized civilization. But here is the tragedy. We know so little about them. The kingdom of Kush left behind monuments and artifacts, but very few detailed written records that have survived or been translated. And unlike Egypt or Rome, there were no contemporary historians writing extensive accounts of Kushite history. So what we know comes from fragmentary Egyptian sources, scattered Greek and Roman mentions, and archaeology. We have their pyramids, we have their gold and jewellery, we have carved reliefs showing these queens in full regalia, but we do not have their voices, we do not have their version of events, we do not have the stories they would have told about themselves. And then, in the centuries after Kush fell in 350 CE, the kingdom was essentially forgotten by the wider world. The pyramids were there, obviously, you cannot hide pyramids, but they were attributed to Egypt, or dismissed as inferior copies, or just ignored. European explorers and archaeologists in the 1800s and 1900s were so fixated on Egypt and its connection to the classical world they admired that they barely paid attention to Sudan. When they did notice the Kushite pyramids, they often looted them, searching for treasure and destroying archaeological context in the process. An Italian explorer named Giuseppe Fellini literally demolished several pyramids in the 1830s looking for gold, and when he found a spectacular cache of jewellery belonging to Kandake Amenishaketo, he sold it to museums in Europe where it remains to this day. So not only were these queens forgotten, but their treasures, their artifacts, the physical evidence of their power and wealth were stolen and scattered across European museums. And then for over a century, those museums did not even properly display or study these artifacts because Kushite civilization was considered less important, less interesting, less worthy of attention than Egypt or Greece or Rome. It is only in recent decades, really, within the last 30 or 40 years, that archaeologists and historians have started to seriously study Kush and recognize the Kandakes for what they were, some of the most powerful female rulers in ancient history. But the damage has been done. Multiple generations of students graduated without ever hearing about Kush. History textbooks would go from Egypt directly to Ethiopia, or jump to West African kingdoms, skipping right over this massive, influential, long-lasting civilization. And the Kandakes, these warrior queens who built pyramids and defeated Rome, became ghosts. Footnotes: curiosities for specialists. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something that might be uncomfortable but is crucial to understanding why these women disappeared from history. When we think about lost history, we often imagine that it's just an accident. that records were destroyed by time, that information was lost to war or natural disaster, that it is nobody's fault. But that is not what happened to the Kandaks. They were not lost, they were erased. And it was a deliberate erasure, driven by racism and Eurocentrism. During the colonial period, European scholars developed a theory that anything impressive in Africa must have come from outside Africa. If there were stone buildings, they must have been built by Arabs or Europeans or some mysterious lost white civilization. If there were complex political systems, they must have been influenced by the Mediterranean world. The idea that Africans could have developed their own sophisticated civilizations without outside help was simply rejected, and the Kandaks did not fit that narrative. Here were black African women ruling a powerful kingdom, building monuments, negotiating with Rome as equals. That was too threatening to the colonial worldview, which needed Africans to be primitive in order to justify colonization. So the Kandaks were disappeared, not by destroying the evidence, the pyramids were still there, the inscriptions were still there, but by ignoring it, by not teaching it, by not putting it in textbooks, by not making documentaries or movies about it. And that is a different kind of erasure, maybe even more insidious because it lets us pretend it is not deliberate. Oh, we just did not know about them. But the information was always there. The choice was made not to share it. And you know what is fascinating and heartbreaking at the same time? There is actually a reference to a Kandaka in the Bible. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, there is a story about Philip the evangelist meeting an Ethiopian eunuch who is described as a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasury. The Candace. A queen so powerful that her title became synonymous with Ethiopian royalty in the ancient Mediterranean world. And yet, how many people who read that Bible verse know they're reading about the Kandaks of Kush? How many sermons have been preached that skip right over the fact that this verse is acknowledging a female African monarch? Even in one of the most widely read texts in human history, the Kandaks are hiding in plain sight, and we have been trained not to see them. It is like that nursery rhyme about Queen Matilda building London Bridge. The evidence is right there. The story is being told, but we have been conditioned to look past it, to not ask questions, to accept that some histories matter and others do not. But here is the beautiful thing that is happening now, in our lifetime. Archaeologists, particularly Sudanese and other African scholars, are reclaiming this history. They are excavating Kushite sites with modern techniques. They are using satellite imagery to find structures that have been buried for millennia. They are working to decipher Meroitic script, to finally read the words the Kushites wrote about themselves. And the picture that is emerging is of a civilization that was incredibly sophisticated, wealthy, artistic, and yes, comfortable with female leadership in ways that would not be seen in Europe for another 2,000 years. The pyramids of Meroe, the capital of Kush, are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are efforts to bring more international attention to Sudanese archaeology. Museums are starting to highlight their Kushite collections instead of hiding them in back rooms, and slowly, painfully slowly, the Kandaks are being remembered. Not as curiosities, not as exceptions, but as what they were, powerful queens who ruled one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. Amanirenas defeated Rome. Let that sink in. A black African woman in the 1st century BCE led armies that fought the Roman Empire to a standstill and negotiated a peace treaty that preserved her kingdom's independence for centuries. That should be taught in every world history class. That should be common knowledge. Children should grow up knowing her name the way they know Cleopatra's, Alexander's, Caesar's, but they do not. And that is not an accident. So tonight, we are saying her name, Kandake Amanirenas, the one-eyed warrior queen who made Rome retreat, the leader who buried Augustus Caesar's head beneath her temple steps, the woman who has been erased from history but whose pyramids still stand in the Sudanese desert, silent witnesses to her power. And Amanirenas was not the only African queen whose military brilliance has been buried. While she was fighting Rome in the south, other kingdoms across Africa had their own warrior queens, their own female military leaders, their own women who expanded territories and commanded armies. And one of the most formidable, one whose campaigns were so successful that they became legend, ruled in West Africa centuries later. Her name was Amina, and she was called the Warrior Queen of Zazzau. Let me take you to 16th century Nigeria, to the Hausa kingdoms, where a woman was about to expand an empire and build walls that still stand today. If you have ever been told that women are not naturally suited for military leadership, that women are too emotional for warfare, that throughout history women have always been the protected rather than the protectors, then you need to hear about Queen Amina of Zazzau, because in the 16th century, in what is now northern Nigeria, there was a woman who commanded cavalry charges, who led military campaigns for 34 years straight, who expanded her territory across multiple modern countries, and who built fortifications so impressive that they are still standing 500 years later and are still called Amina's Walls. Her story begins in 1530 in the city of Zazzau, which is now known as Zaria. The Hausa kingdoms of West Africa were a network of city-states connected by trade, culture, and frequent warfare. They were wealthy beyond imagination, sitting at the crossroads of the trans-Saharan trade routes. Gold from the south, salt from the north, cola nuts, ivory, textiles, horses, and yes, enslaved people. The Hausa states controlled this trade, and whoever controlled the trade routes controlled unimaginable wealth and power. And into this world of commerce and conflict, Amina was born. Her mother was Bakwa Turunku, a formidable woman in her own right, who would eventually become Queen of Zazzau. In the Hausa political system, women could hold significant power. Queen mothers and senior women wielded influence, managed royal households, controlled resources. This was not unusual. But what was unusual, what makes Amina's story so extraordinary, is that from childhood she was trained not just in statecraft, but in warfare. Her parents saw something in her: intelligence, courage, strategic thinking, and instead of trying to suppress it or channel it into acceptable feminine pursuits, they cultivated it. They gave her military training. They taught her to ride. They taught her to command. Can you imagine what that must have looked like? A young girl in the 1540s, in full armour, learning cavalry tactics alongside boys and young men who would become her generals. The sources tell us that even as a child, Amina was drawn to the battlefield. She did not have to be forced or convinced. She wanted to be there. She wanted to learn how armies moved, how sieges worked, how to read terrain and weather and human psychology to win battles. And her family let her. They encouraged her. And that early training would change the course of West African history. When Amina's father died, her younger brother Karama ascended to the throne as was traditional, and Amina became the Magajiya, the heir apparent. But she was more than just a princess waiting for her turn. She commanded the cavalry, she participated in military campaigns, she fought in battles. The chronicles describe her as a warrior of extraordinary skill, feared by enemies, respected by her own troops. And when Karama died around 1576, there was apparently no question about who should rule. The nobles, the military leaders, the people, they chose Amina, and she became Queen of Zazzau. Now here is what most queens would do after ascending to the throne: consolidate power, secure alliances through marriage, focus on internal administration and diplomacy, not Amina. Within 3 months of becoming queen, she launched a military campaign, and she would not stop campaigning for the next 34 years. Think about that timeline. 3 decades of continuous military expansion. This was not a woman playing at being a warrior. This was a professional military commander who happened to also be a queen. Amina's military strategy was brilliant. The Hausa kingdoms had been fighting each other for generations, locked in cycles of rivalry and revenge. Amina changed the game. Instead of just raiding and skirmishing, she launched wars of conquest and expansion. She pushed the boundaries of Zazzau far beyond their original limits, extending her territory into what is now parts of Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Her army was feared for its discipline and effectiveness, and Amina herself led from the front. She was not directing battles from a safe distance. She rode with her cavalry, she was in the fight. One of her most significant innovations was the construction of fortified walls around the cities and territories she conquered. These were not just defensive structures, they were statements of power, markers of Zazzau's expanded territory, protection for the trade routes she now controlled. The walls were built of earth and stone thick enough to withstand siege weapons, tall enough to give defenders the advantage. And they worked. Cities that submitted to Amina and accepted her walls were protected, prosperous, integrated into her growing empire. Cities that resisted were besieged, conquered, and then walled anyway. The walls sent a message. This territory belongs to Zazzau now. This is permanent. And here is the remarkable thing. Those walls are still there. You can visit northern Nigeria today and see Amina's walls still standing in places. 500 years old, surviving erosion, weather, development, time itself. These are not myths. These are not legends exaggerated through oral tradition. These are physical, measurable, visitable proof that Queen Amina was real, that her campaigns were real, that her empire building was real. And yet, how many people outside of West Africa know her name? There is a tradition in Hausa oral history that says Amina never married, that she took lovers, powerful warriors and princes, but never allowed any man to claim her in marriage, because marriage would have meant sharing her power, submitting to a husband's authority, producing heirs who might challenge her reign. Some versions of the story say she would take a lover in each city she conquered and then have him killed the next morning, ensuring he could never boast of having slept with the queen, never use that intimacy to claim power. Is that true? We do not know. It might be slander from enemies who could not accept a woman ruling alone. It might be exaggeration, it might be metaphor, or it might be true. It might be that Amina understood power so well that she refused to let romance or marriage compromise it. What we do know for certain is that Amina never had children, or at least none that survived or were acknowledged. And that in itself is significant. Most queens throughout history, if they ruled at all, did so as regents for their sons or alongside their husbands. Their power was derivative, borrowed, temporary. But Amina ruled in her own right, owing her position to no man, sharing her authority with no one. She was the monarch, full stop, and she remained the monarch until her death. The oral traditions say she died around 1610, still campaigning, still at war. She was in her 70s, some versions say she died in battle. Some say she died during a campaign, but from natural causes. Either way, she died the way she lived, at the head of her army, in the field, as a warrior queen who never stopped fighting. And after her death, Zazzau remained a powerful kingdom, one of the major house estates, its wealth and influence secured by the territory Amina had conquered and the trade routes she'd protected. So why do we not know her name? Why is Amina of Zazzau not taught alongside Joan of Arc or Elizabeth I or Catherine the Great when we talk about female leaders who changed history? You already know the answer. She was African. The European scholars who wrote the first comprehensive world histories in the 1700s and 1800s did not include African kingdoms unless they were interacting with Europe. And Amina Zazou, powerful as it was an internal African power. They traded across the Sahara, yes, but they were not colonized by Europeans during her lifetime, so European historians ignored them. And then when colonialism did come to Nigeria in the 1800s, when the British took control and started writing histories of the region, they had an agenda. They needed to portray pre-colonial Africa as chaotic, primitive, barbaric, in need of European civilization and order. Stories like Amina's, stories of sophisticated kingdoms with professional armies, strategic leaders, extensive trade networks, and urban centers, those stories contradicted the narrative. So they were downplayed, dismissed as legend, or simply not recorded in the official histories that would be taught in schools. But the Hausa people never forgot. In northern Nigeria, Amina is a legendary figure. There are songs about her, poems, stories passed down through generations. She is a symbol of courage, independence, military genius, female empowerment. There is a statue of her. Schools are named after her. She is part of the cultural identity of the region. But that local African memory of her has only recently started to break through into global consciousness. It's only in the last few decades that historians outside of Africa have started to take her story seriously, to research it, to include it in broader narratives of world history. And part of that is because the sources are complicated. We do not have contemporary written accounts of Amina's reign. The Hausa kingdoms had written language. They wrote in an Arabic script. But most of the documents that might have existed have been lost to time, climate, conflict, and colonial disruption. What we have is oral tradition, which is incredibly valuable but which Western academics have historically dismissed as unreliable. We have the archaeological evidence, the walls, the remains of cities, trade goods, that show the extent of Zazou's influence. We have later written accounts, some from the 1800s, that reference earlier histories. And we have cultural memory, the fact that 5 centuries later, people still tell Amina's story. Is every detail of that story historically accurate? Probably not. Oral traditions evolve. They incorporate myth. They sometimes conflate different people or events. But the core of it, the essential truth that there was a queen named Amina who ruled Zazou in the late 1500s and early 1600s, who led military campaigns, who expanded her territory dramatically, who built fortifications that still stand, that is real, that is history, and it deserves to be treated as such. There is a Hausa proverb, Amina, daughter of Nikatau, a woman as capable as a man. And I have complicated feelings about that proverb. On one hand, it is honouring her. It is saying she was extraordinary. But on the other hand, it is measuring her against male standards, saying she was good for a woman, as if being a woman is normally a limitation that she somehow overcame. And that is the trap that powerful women throughout history have been caught in. If they succeed, they are told they are like men, or better than most men, which implies that their success is exceptional, unusual, almost unnatural. It is never allowed to be just success, just competence, just a person doing what they were good at. Amina was not a woman pretending to be a man. She was not trying to overcome her gender. She was a military leader and a queen who happened to be female, and in her culture at that time that was possible. Not common, but possible. The Hausa kingdoms had traditions of powerful women. They had queen mothers who wielded political power. They had women who controlled trade and wealth. So Amina was not emerging from nowhere. She was standing on foundations that her culture had built. And then she took those foundations and built something unprecedented on top of them. And that is what makes her erasure from global history so frustrating, because she was not an exception. She was part of a tradition of African female leadership that predates and parallels anything happening in Europe at the same time. While Europe was burning women as witches for daring to have opinions, African kingdoms were crowning them as queens. While European princesses were being married off as political pawns with no say in their own fates, African princesses were being trained in statecraft and warfare. The narrative that women have always been oppressed, always been powerless, always been secondary, that is a European narrative. It is not universal. It was never universal. But that narrative became universal through colonialism, through the spread of European education systems, through the dominance of European and American media and publishing. And so we ended up in a world where everyone knows about Henry VIII's 6 wives, but almost nobody knows about the African queens who ruled empires. Where everyone has heard of Napoleon, but not of Amina. Where military history is taught as if it is exclusively the domain of men, and the women who commanded armies, who won battles, who expanded kingdoms are just gone, forgotten, erased. Except they are not really gone, because the walls are still standing, because the oral traditions are still being told, because historians and archaeologists and educators are starting to dig into these stories to demand that they be taken seriously, to insist that African history is world history and deserves to be taught as such. And slowly, too slowly but surely, women like Amina are being reclaimed. There is a Nigerian author and historian named Nnedi Okorafor who has written about the importance of telling African stories, particularly stories of African women, in ways that do not center European validation or European perspectives. And she makes this point that has stuck with me. These stories do not need to be rescued. They have always existed. They have always been told. What needs to change is who is listening, who is teaching, who is deciding what counts as real history. Amina does not need us to believe in her. Her walls exist whether we acknowledge them or not. What we need is the humility to admit that the history we were taught was incomplete, was biased, and was designed to center certain people and erase others. So tonight, we are listening. We are acknowledging. We are saying that Amina of Zaza was one of the greatest military leaders of the 16th century period, not one of the greatest female military leaders, not one of the greatest African military leaders, one of the greatest military leaders, full stop. She expanded an empire. She built fortifications that lasted 5 centuries. She commanded respect and fear and loyalty for 34 years of continuous campaigning. And her name should be taught alongside Alexander, alongside Genghis Khan, alongside any other conqueror in history. But Amina is not the only powerful woman we need to reclaim from the deliberate forgetting of history, because while African queens were being erased by colonial scholars in the 1800s and 1900s, something equally insidious was happening in Asia. The most powerful woman in Chinese history, a woman who ruled one of the largest empires on earth, was being systematically demonized, slandered, and turned into a cautionary tale about why women should never hold power. Her name was Wu Zetian, and if you think the stories about Theodora were vicious, if you think the treatment of Matilda was unfair, wait until you hear how Chinese historians spent 1400 years destroying the reputation of the only woman who ever dared to call herself Emperor of China. What happens when a woman reaches the absolute pinnacle of power in a civilization that believes women are fundamentally incapable of ruling? What happens when she does not just advise the emperor, not just influence policy from behind the scenes, but actually seizes the throne and declares herself emperor, not empress, but emperor, claiming the masculine title that had been held exclusively by men for nearly 1,000 years? The answer is that history unleashes 14 centuries of character assassination so vicious, so relentless, so creative in its cruelty, that it becomes almost impressive in its dedication to destroying her. Wu Zetian is perhaps the most slandered woman in world history, and the slander worked. For over a millennium, Chinese historians portrayed her as a demon in human form, a murderous monster who killed her own children, a sexually depraved sorceress who bewitched emperors and destroyed dynasties. And even today, even with modern scholarship that has revealed how much of that narrative was propaganda, most people who have heard of Wu Zetian know her primarily through those lies. She is the wicked empress, the female villain, the cautionary tale about what happens when women grab power they are not supposed to have. But what if I told you that the actual evidence, when you strip away the propaganda, shows something completely different? What if the woman they called a demon was actually one of the most effective administrators in Chinese history? What if her reign, far from being catastrophic, was a period of economic prosperity, military expansion and social reform that laid the groundwork for one of China's golden ages? What if everything you thought you knew about Wu Zetian was a lie designed to ensure no other woman would ever dare to follow in her footsteps? Let us start at the beginning. Wu Zhao, that was her birth name, was born around 624 CE during the Tang dynasty, one of the most brilliant periods in Chinese history. Her family was not aristocratic, but they were wealthy. Her father had been a supporter of the first Tang emperor and was rewarded with position and status. So Wu grew up in a household with access to education, which was unusual for girls at the time. She learned to read and write. She studied literature, music, history, and according to the sources, she was intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious, a dangerous combination for a woman in 7th century China. When Wu was about 13 or 14 years old, she was selected to enter the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong. Now, the imperial harem was not what you might imagine from Western harems. It was a highly structured bureaucracy with ranks and titles and specific roles. The emperor might have dozens or even hundreds of women in his harem, but most of them he would never touch. They were there to serve the empress, to perform ceremonial functions, to demonstrate the emperor's wealth and status. And Wu, as a 5th-rank concubine, was pretty low on that hierarchy. Emperor Taizong gave her a nickname, Fair Flatterer, and historians have debated what that meant. Was it mocking? Was it affectionate? Was it sexual? We do not know. What we do know is that Wu spent over a decade in Taizong's harem, and during that time she apparently caught the attention of his son, Li Ji, the crown prince. The historical sources are vague about exactly how much contact they had, but there are suggestions that they became close, perhaps even romantically involved while Taizong was still alive, which, by the way, would have been absolutely forbidden and potentially treasonous. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, protocol dictated that his concubines who had not borne him sons should have their heads shaved and be sent to Buddhist convents to live out their lives in religious seclusion. This was supposed to be respectful, honouring their connection to the dead emperor by dedicating them to spiritual pursuits. But in reality, it was a way of removing potential complications. Wu was sent to a convent. She was about 25 years old and her life at the imperial court was apparently over. Except Li Ji, who was now Emperor Gaozong, did not forget her. In 651, 2 years after his father's death, he visited the convent. Whether this was genuinely to pay respects or an excuse to see Wu, we cannot know. But according to legend, when he saw her with her shaved head in nun's robes, both of them broke down weeping. And shortly after that, Wu was quietly brought back to the palace, ostensibly as a servant to the current empress, but really as the new emperor's concubine. This was scandalous. She had been his father's woman. There were incest taboos, there were protocols, there were rules against this exact situation. But Emperor Gaozong wanted her, and he was the emperor, so rules could be bent. Now here is where the propaganda really starts. According to the official histories written by Confucian scholars who despised her, Wu immediately began a ruthless campaign to claw her way to power. They say she murdered her own infant daughter and framed the empress for it, leading to the empress being deposed and eventually killed. They say she had the former empress and the emperor's favourite consort imprisoned in terrible conditions, then beaten to death, their hands and feet cut off, their bodies thrown into wine vats. These stories are presented as established fact in traditional Chinese histories, but modern historians have looked at these accusations with more skeptical eyes, and the problems start to emerge. First, there are contradictions between different historical accounts. Second, many of these stories appear in texts written decades or even centuries after the events, by men who had political reasons to hate Wu. Third, the accusations follow very familiar patterns of misogynistic propaganda. The evil woman who murders children, who uses sexual manipulation, who is unnaturally cruel. We have seen these same tropes used against Theodora, against medieval European queens, against pretty much any powerful woman in history. They are not evidence. They are archetypes. What we can document is this. By 655, Wu had become Emperor Gaozong's favourite consort. She gave birth to sons, which gave her status and security, and crucially, she was politically brilliant. Emperor Gaozong suffered from some kind of illness, possibly a stroke or debilitating headaches, that left him increasingly incapable of handling the complexities of ruling a massive empire. And Wu stepped in. At first, she probably just helped him with paperwork, advice, administrative details, but gradually she became essential. She was not just influencing him, she was governing. In 660, Wu was given the title of Empress Consort with full ceremonial authority. And from that point on, for the next quarter century, she was effectively the co-ruler of the Tang Empire. When Gaozong's illness worsened and he could barely function, Wu ran the government. She made appointments, she received foreign ambassadors, she issued edicts, and here is what makes this period so fascinating. The empire thrived, the economy grew, the borders expanded, the civil service system was reformed and strengthened. Wu promoted people based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. She held competitive examinations to find talented administrators. She supported education and literacy, but all of this success was happening while a woman was making the decisions. And the Confucian officials, the male aristocrats who had held power for generations, were increasingly uncomfortable. They muttered that the natural order was being violated, that a woman governing was against the will of heaven, that disaster would surely follow. And yet disaster did not follow. The empire kept prospering, which made them even more uncomfortable, because their entire ideological framework insisted that female rule was impossible, unnatural, doomed to fail. And it was not failing. When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, Wu became Empress Dowager, ruling as regent for her son, Emperor Zhongzong, but her son was weak, easily influenced by his wife's family, making terrible decisions. So Wu deposed him, and put her younger son Emperor Ruzong on the throne instead. And when he also proved ineffective, she made the decision that would define her legacy and ensure her eternal demonization in Chinese history. In 690, Wu Zetian declared herself emperor, not regent, not Empress Dowager, emperor. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the Tang dynasty. She took the title Shengshen Huangdi, the sacred and divine emperor. Do you understand how revolutionary this was? For nearly 1,000 years since the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, the title Huangdi had been exclusively male. It carried connotations of masculine power, of the mandate of heaven passing through the male line. And Wu said, "I am taking it. I am not ruling through a man. I am not borrowing authority. I am the emperor, me, a woman, and you will acknowledge it." She ruled in her own name for 15 years, from 690 to 705. And during those 15 years, she continued the policies that had made her regency successful. She expanded the imperial examination system even further, creating opportunities for talented people from non-aristocratic backgrounds to serve in government. This was threatening to the old families who had monopolized power, but it strengthened the empire by drawing on a wider pool of talent. She commissioned Buddhist temples and artwork, supporting religious institutions that welcomed her as a patron. She conducted military campaigns that expanded Tang borders into Central Asia. She corresponded with rulers of neighboring kingdoms as an equal, and she invented new Chinese characters, including one for her own name. This is such a power move that it almost makes me laugh. The existing character for Zhao, her family name, was not grand enough, so she invented a new one, a character showing the sun and moon above the sky, representing illumination over heaven and earth. That was her, Wu Zhao, the woman who put the sun and moon above the heavens. But the Confucian establishment never accepted her. They could not. To accept her would be to admit that their entire worldview was wrong, that women were not inherently inferior, that the natural order they had built their power on was not natural at all, but merely a social construct that served their interests. So they waited, they plotted. And in 705, when Wu was 80 years old and in failing health, a group of officials staged a coup. They killed her two favorite advisors, brothers named Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, and they forced Wu to abdicate in favor of her son. She died 10 months later, in December 705, at the age of 81, and then the character assassination began in earnest. The histories were written by the very men she had threatened, the Confucian scholars who believed female rule was an abomination. They could not deny that the empire had prospered under her rule. They could not deny that her administrative reforms had been effective. So instead, they destroyed her character. They called her a murderer, a monster, a demon. They invented or exaggerated stories about her cruelty, her sexual depravity, her evil nature. They needed her to be a cautionary tale, a horror story, proof that women must never be allowed near power, because look what happens. And for over 1,000 years, that narrative dominated. Chinese history books portrayed Wu Zetian as one of the worst rulers in history, a stain on the empire, a period of darkness. Plays and novels cast her as a villain. Even the location of her tomb became controversial. She was buried alongside her husband, Emperor Gaozong, and her grave marker was left blank. No inscription, no record of her accomplishments, nothing. Some historians argue this was her choice, a gesture of humility or awareness that history would judge her harshly. Others suggest it was the ultimate insult from her successors, erasing her even in death. But here is what is fascinating and hopeful about the modern era. Scholars are finally starting to cut through the propaganda. Historians like Richard Guisseau, Dora Shufang Dien, and others have gone back to the primary sources and analysed them critically, asking, what evidence do we actually have? What can we verify? What are the biases of the sources? And a very different picture of Wu Zetian has emerged. Not a saint, certainly. She was ruthless when she needed to be. She eliminated rivals. She used violence and intimidation to maintain power. But so did every male emperor. The difference is that when men did these things, They were described as strong, decisive, effective rulers. When Wu did them, she was called a demon. Modern scholarship highlights her expansion of the civil service examination system, which made the Chinese government more meritocratic and less aristocratic. It points to the economic growth and territorial expansion during her reign. It notes that she was a patron of arts and education, that she supported Buddhism at a time when it was bringing new ideas and cultural exchange to China. It acknowledges that she faced opposition not because she was incompetent but because she was female, and that the real crisis was not her rule, but the ideological panic it caused among men who could not accept that a woman could govern effectively. There is a Chinese historian named Zhao Rang who has argued that Wu Zetian's reign was actually a crucial bridge period that strengthened the Tang dynasty and set the stage for the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, which is considered the height of the Tang Golden Age. In other words, without Wu's reforms and consolidation of power, that golden age might not have happened. But she does not get credit for it. He gets the glory, she gets the blame and the slander, and here is the saddest part. It worked. Wu Zetian was the only woman in over 3,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule in her own right as emperor. No other woman even tried. The lesson was too clear, too terrifying. Even if you succeed, even if the empire prospers under your rule, they will call you a monster. They will write your name in infamy. They will make an example of you to ensure no other woman dares to follow. And that lesson held for 13 centuries. But we are living in a different time now. We have the tools to question old narratives, to look at evidence with fresh eyes, to ask whose interests were served by portraying powerful women as evil. And when we do that work, when we peel back the layers of propaganda and misogyny, what we find is not a demon but a human being. A woman who was brilliant and ambitious and ruthless and effective. A woman who ruled an empire for decades and left it stronger than she found it. A woman who has been punished for her success by 14 centuries of slander. So tonight, we are reclaiming Wu Zetian not as a villain, not as an exception, but as what she was, Emperor of China, a ruler whose accomplishments deserve to be measured by the same standards we apply to men, and whose story reveals the incredible lengths that history will go to erase, distort and demonize women who refuse to accept the limitations placed on them. But Wu Zetian's story of erasure through demonization is not the only way powerful women have been disappeared from history. Sometimes the erasure is more subtle, more insidious. Sometimes women do not become villains in the historical record. They just vanish. They're there one moment, alive, important, royal. And then the historical record goes silent, and we never hear from them again. These are the women who literally disappeared, and their mysteries have haunted historians for centuries. Let me tell you about the princess who vanished without a trace, and the theories, legends, and desperate searches that followed. There is something uniquely haunting about a disappearance. When someone dies, even tragically, there is closure, a grave, a monument, a place to mourn. But when someone simply vanishes, when the historical record goes silent mid-sentence and we never learn what happened, the mystery becomes almost unbearable. And throughout history, royal women have disappeared with disturbing frequency. Some were murdered, some were hidden away, some escaped and reinvented themselves, and some we genuinely do not know. They were there, documented, real, and then they were gone. And tonight, I want to introduce you to some of the most fascinating disappearances in royal history, because these mysteries reveal something dark about how disposable royal women were considered to be. Let us begin with one of the earliest and strangest cases, Princess Joan of England, daughter of King John. Now, King John is famous for being, well, terrible. He is the villain in the Robin Hood stories, the king who was so unpopular that he was forced to sign the Magna Carta. He lost territory in France, he fought with the Pope, he was paranoid, cruel, and generally considered one of England's worst monarchs. But one of the lesser-known tragedies of his reign is what happened to his daughter Joan. Joan was born around 1108, which means she was about 11 or 12 years old when, in 1200, her father arranged for her to marry Hugh Tex of Lusignan, a powerful French nobleman. This was standard medieval diplomacy. Royal daughters were bargaining chips, traded to secure alliances and prevent wars. Joan was sent to France to be prepared for the marriage. She would live in Hugh's household, learning French customs, being groomed to be the future Countess of Lusignan. Everything was arranged. The wedding was planned. And then, in 1204, shortly before the wedding was supposed to take place, Princess Joan vanished. Just gone. The historical record goes completely silent. There is no wedding, there is no mention of her death, there is no record of her returning to England. She simply stops appearing in any documents, any chronicles, any royal accounts. It is as if she was erased from existence. And here is where it gets even stranger. Her father, King John, married off one of his other daughters to a different member of the Lusignan family shortly afterward, which suggests the alliance was still important. So what happened to Joan? Why was the first marriage cancelled? Where did she go? The theories range from mundane to sinister. Some historians suggest she died of illness, and the records were simply lost. Medieval record-keeping was not perfect, and plenty of deaths went unrecorded. But Joan was a royal princess, betrothed to a major nobleman. Her death should have been documented, should have been mourned publicly. Other theories are darker. Did she elope with someone else, disgracing her family and being quietly erased from the record as punishment? Was she murdered? Was she locked away in a convent, her existence inconvenient after some political shift? We do not know. We will probably never know. Princess Joan of England is a ghost, a name in a few documents, a life that started and then just stopped. And the most chilling part is how little effort was made to find her or record what happened. She was 12 years old, a child, and when she disappeared, the response from the historical record seems to be a collective shrug, as if losing a princess was just an unfortunate administrative detail, not worth investigating or commemorating. That is how little royal women's lives were valued. They were useful for making alliances, but if that usefulness ended, if they disappeared, well, there were always other daughters to trade. Now let us jump forward several centuries to one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in British history, the princes in the Tower. Except, here is the thing that most people do not realise. One of those princes was actually a princess, in the broader sense of royal children who disappeared, and there were royal women involved in this tragedy whose fates are equally unknown and equally tragic. I am talking about the family of Edward IV. When King Edward IV died in 1483, he left behind two sons, Edward and Richard, aged 12 and 9. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was supposed to be their protector. Instead, he declared their mother's marriage invalid, which made the boys illegitimate, and he had himself crowned King Richard III. The two boys were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety, and they were seen less and less frequently, until eventually they stopped being seen at all. They vanished. And to this day we do not know with certainty what happened to them. The prevailing theory is that Richard III had them murdered to secure his throne. In 1674, workmen at the Tower found a wooden box containing the skeletons of two children, which are now buried in Westminster Abbey and are believed to be the princes. But we cannot be sure. But here is what often gets left out of this story. Those boys had 5 sisters, 5, and their fates are almost as mysterious and far more complicated. The oldest, Elizabeth of York, eventually married Henry VII and became the mother of Henry VIII, so her story is relatively well documented. But what about the others? What happened to Cecily, Anne, Catherine, and Bridget? When their uncle usurped the throne, when their brothers disappeared, these girls were suddenly dangerous. They had royal blood. They could be rallying points for rebellions. They could be married off to enemies of Richard III. They were problems that needed to be managed. Some of them were sent to convents. Bridget became a nun and lived her entire life in a priory, dying in obscurity around 1517. The historical record tells us almost nothing about her life, her thoughts, her feelings about being shut away because her birth made her dangerous. Catherine married well but died young, possibly in childbirth. Anne married into minor nobility and disappeared from history. These were daughters of a king, sisters to princes, and they were scattered, hidden, erased, because their existence was inconvenient. No one thought to record their stories in detail because they were just girls, just women, just collateral damage in the wars of men. And here is a detail that breaks my heart. After the boys disappeared, their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the Dowager Queen, tried desperately to find out what happened to them. She negotiated with Richard III. She eventually supported Henry Tudor's invasion, hoping he would discover the truth and punish whoever killed her sons. But the answers she sought never came. She died in 1492, probably never knowing for certain what happened to her children. And then she too was partly erased from history. Henry VII, her son-in-law, had her stripped of her lands and sent to a convent, possibly because she knew too much, possibly because she was asking too many uncomfortable questions. Even queens could be disappeared if they became inconvenient. But sometimes the disappearance is not tragic. Sometimes it is triumphant. Sometimes a woman chooses to vanish, to escape the constraints of royal life, to reinvent herself completely. And that brings us to one of the most delightful hoaxes in history, Princess Caraboo. This is a story that shows us how much people wanted to believe in exotic, mysterious royal women, and how one clever young woman exploited that desire to create an entirely fictional identity. In April 1817, a young woman appeared in the village of Almondsbury in Gloucestershire, England. She was dressed in strange clothes, spoke a language no one recognised, and seemed confused and lost. The local cobbler, Samuel Worrell, and his wife took her in, trying to figure out who she was. She could not or would not speak English. She communicated through gestures and drawings. She drew pictures of herself in exotic settings of temples and foreign landscapes, and gradually, through a combination of mime, improvisation, and the projections of the people around her, a story emerged. She was Princess Caraboo from a mysterious island called Javasu, and she had been kidnapped by pirates, escaped, and somehow ended up in rural England. The local gentry were fascinated. Here was a real foreign princess, right in their village. She was exotic, beautiful, mysterious. She performed strange rituals. She refused to sleep in beds, preferring to sleep on the floor. She prayed to a god called Allah Ta'ala. She fenced with the sword. She was everything the English imagination wanted an Eastern princess to be. And the Worrells, bless them, completely bought it. They housed her, fed her, introduced her to local society. Newspaper articles were written about the mysterious Princess Caraboo. Artists came to paint her portrait. She became a minor celebrity. This went on for months. And then, in June 1817, a Portuguese sailor came forward and said he could understand her language. He interviewed her and reported that yes, she was indeed Princess Caraboo from the island of Javasu in the Indian Ocean, and her story of kidnapping and escape was true. The gentry were thrilled. The mystery was solved. Except, of course, it was not. Because the Portuguese sailor was either in on the hoax or had invented his own translation to impress people. And then someone recognized her. Her name was Mary Baker. She was not a princess, she was the daughter of a cobbler from Witheridge in Devon. She had worked as a servant, had a troubled life, possibly gave birth to an illegitimate child, and had wandered around England performing various cons and impersonations before landing on the Princess Caraboo character. When confronted, she confessed. The exotic language was gibberish she made up. The strange customs were things she had invented or read about. The whole thing was a performance, and she had fooled educated, wealthy people for months because they wanted to believe in the mysterious foreign princess. Now, here is what I love about this story. Mary Baker was not punished particularly harshly. There was embarrassment, certainly. The Worrells felt foolish, but there was also a kind of admiration for the audacity of it. Mary was sent to America, where she briefly tried to capitalize on her fame by performing as Princess Caraboo on stage. It did not work well. Americans were less charmed by the hoax. She eventually returned to England, lived quietly, sold leeches for a living, and died in 1864. And her story became a legend, a reminder that sometimes the exotic princess is just a clever woman with nothing to lose, performing the role that society wanted her to play. But Mary Baker's disappearance by choice, her reinvention as Princess Caraboo, is the exception. Most royal women who disappeared did not choose it. They were hidden, murdered, or simply forgotten. And the fact that so many of these disappearances remain unsolved, that we genuinely do not know what happened to dozens of royal women throughout history, tells us something stark about how expendable they were considered to be. When a king disappeared, it was a crisis. Searches were conducted, records were kept, histories were written. But when a princess vanished, often silence, as if her life had never mattered at all. There is a historian named Helen Castor who wrote a book called She-Wolves about the women who wielded power in medieval England, and she makes this observation that has stuck with me. The historical record preserves what the powerful want preserved, and powerful men, for the most part, did not want to preserve stories about women. Women were supporting characters in male narratives. So when a woman's story became inconvenient, or when she ceased to be useful, the record just stops. She is erased not through deliberate destruction of evidence, but through deliberate neglect. No one bothered to write down what happened to her, because no one thought her story mattered. And that is true not just for the women who literally disappeared, but for all the women we have talked about tonight. Theodora, Matilda, Marjorie, Nzinga, Amanirenas, and Mina Wu Zetian, they did not physically vanish, but their stories were disappeared from the mainstream historical narrative. They were hidden in footnotes, dismissed as anomalies, or, in Wu Zetian's case, actively demonized to ensure they would not inspire other women. The methods varied, but the goal was the same, to make sure that when we think about history, we think about men. Kings, emperors, generals, scholars. Not queens, not empresses, not the women who ruled, fought, built, and shaped the world alongside them, and the women who disappeared into convents, who were married off to distant lands, who were locked away when they became politically inconvenient. These were not rare exceptions. This was standard practice. Medieval and early modern Europe, Asia, Africa, everywhere. Royal women were assets to be managed. And when they could not be managed, when they became problems or threats or simply unwanted, they were removed. Sometimes physically, sometimes just from the record. Either way, they disappeared. But we are finding them again. Historians are asking new questions, looking at old sources with fresh eyes, excavating the archives for the women who were written out. DNA testing is solving mysteries that seemed unsolvable. In 1991, when the remains of the Romanov family were found in Russia, DNA analysis finally proved that Anastasia Romanov had not escaped the execution of her family in 1918, ending decades of speculation and imposter claims. In 2012, DNA confirmed the identity of King Richard III's remains, and that discovery has renewed interest in solving other medieval mysteries, including what really happened to the princes in the tower and the royal women connected to that tragedy. We are living in an era where science, archaeology, and feminist historical inquiry are combining to recover these lost stories. And what we are discovering is that the women who disappeared, who were erased, who were forgotten, were not passive victims. They were political actors, survivors, sometimes willing conspirators in their own vanishing acts, sometimes tragic casualties of power struggles they did not control. But they were people. They had agency, even when their choices were limited. They had stories, even when those stories were not recorded, and they deserve to be remembered. Because here is the truth that the disappearances, the erasures, the gaps in the historical record are all trying to hide. Women have always been part of history. Always, not on the margins, not as decoration or footnotes, as central participants in the events that shaped our world. And when we forget them, when we accept the narrative that history is just the story of great men, and the women around them were unimportant, we are not just being historically inaccurate, we are perpetuating the same power structures that erased them in the first place. The women who disappeared are reminding us to ask, who else is missing from the story? What other voices have been censored? What other perspectives have been dismissed as unimportant? And as we continue this journey through the royal women history tried to forget, we are going to meet two more queens whose stories encapsulate everything we have learned so far. Women who were brilliant, ambitious, powerful, and who were punished for it by being labelled as too much, too aggressive, too political, too ambitious. In other words, too threatening to the men who needed them to stay quiet. Let me introduce you to the forgotten queens of conquest. Margaret of Anjou and Isabella of France, two women who fought wars, commanded armies, and were turned into villains for refusing to accept the limitations placed on them. Ambition is such an interesting word, is it not? When we describe a man as ambitious, it is usually a compliment. He is driven, he is visionary, he knows what he wants and pursues it relentlessly. But when we describe a woman as ambitious, the word curdles, it becomes an accusation. She is grasping, she is unfeminine, she is dangerous. And throughout history, ambitious women have been systematically punished for wanting power, for refusing to stay quiet, for daring to participate in politics at the highest levels. And two of the most ambitious queens in medieval European history were Margaret of Anjou and Isabella of France, both of whom have been written into history as villains, as she-wolves, as unnatural women who destroyed their kingdoms through their grasping ambition. But what if the real story is that they were brilliant political operators trapped in marriages to incompetent men, and they did what they had to do to survive? Let us start with Isabella of France, because her story is so dramatic, so shocking that it reads like a thriller. And yet, most people have never heard of her beyond the nickname that was designed to make her sound monstrous, the she-wolf of France. That name was given to her by chroniclers who were horrified that a queen would dare to depose her own husband, the king. But those same chroniclers conveniently forget to mention that her husband was one of the worst kings in English history, and that Isabella had very good reasons for doing what she did. Isabella was born around 1295, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. She was beautiful, educated, politically astute, and in 1308, when she was only 12 years old, she was married to King Edward II of England, This was supposed to be a glorious alliance joining the two most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe, but the marriage was a disaster from the very beginning, because Edward II was not interested in his beautiful, intelligent wife. He was interested in his male favourites, and I do not mean that subtly. The chronicles are explicit. Edward lavished attention, gifts, and political power on his male companions, particularly a man named Piers Gaveston, to the complete exclusion and humiliation of his wife. Now, we need to be careful here about applying modern concepts of sexuality to medieval people. Was Edward II gay, bisexual? Was his relationship with Gaveston romantic, sexual, just intensely emotional friendship? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that he gave Gaveston more attention, respect, and political authority than he gave his queen. He gave Gaveston jewellery that should have gone to Isabella. He spent his time with Gaveston instead of with her, and the English nobles were furious, not necessarily because of the sexual implications, but because Edward was giving power to an upstart minor nobleman instead of governing properly. Isabella, meanwhile, was 12 years old, married to a man who was openly infatuated with someone else, humiliated at court and politically sidelined. Can you imagine? She had been raised as a French princess, daughter of one of the most powerful kings in Europe, and now she was supposed to smile and play the decorative queen while her husband gave her role, her influence, her very place in the political structure to his favourite. For years she endured this. She did her duty. She gave birth to 4 children, including the future Edward III. She performed her ceremonial functions. She played the good wife, and she waited. Gaveston was eventually executed by rebellious nobles in 1312, but Edward just found new favourites. The Despencer family, Hugh Despencer the elder and his son Hugh Despencer the younger, became Edward's new obsessions. And they were worse than Gaveston because they were not just Edward's companions, they were actively corrupt, using their influence with the king to seize lands, extort money, and crush anyone who opposed them. England was falling apart, the nobles were in rebellion. The Scottish were winning battles and reclaiming territory. The economy was struggling, and Edward was too busy enriching the Despensers to govern effectively. By 1325, Isabella had had enough. She was sent to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with her brother, the French king, about disputed territories. And once she was in France, out from under Edward's control and the Despensers' surveillance, she made her move. She refused to return to England. She announced publicly that she feared for her life, that the Despensers were a threat to her and to the kingdom, and that she would not come back until they were removed from power. And then she did something absolutely unprecedented. She took a lover. His name was Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. And together, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army. They invaded England in 1326, and the country rallied to them. Edward II's government collapsed without a fight. The Despensers were captured and executed, and Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents. For 4 years, from 1327 to 1330, Isabella was effectively the ruler of England. She governed through her son, but everyone knew the real power was hers. And this is where the character assassination begins in earnest. The chroniclers could not stand it. A queen ruling, a queen who had deposed her husband, a queen with a lover who was not her husband. This was everything medieval society said women should not do, so they called her the she-wolf. They said she was cruel, ambitious, unnatural. They accused her of murdering Edward II, who died in captivity in 1327 under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts claim he was murdered in a particularly gruesome way, though modern historians doubt these sensationalized stories. But whether Isabella ordered his death or not, she was blamed for it. The woman who dared to claim power was turned into a monster. And here is the bitter ending. In 30, when her son Edward III turned 18, he staged a coup against his own mother. He had Mortimer arrested and executed, and Isabella was forced into retirement. She was not killed, not imprisoned in the brutal way that her husband had been, but she was removed from power and spent the last 28 years of her life in comfortable but enforced obscurity. She died in 1358, and by then the narrative about her was already set. She was the she-wolf, the bad queen, the woman who destroyed her husband and ruled when she should not have. Not the woman who saved England from an incompetent king and corrupt favourites. Not the political genius who managed to overthrow a monarch without massive bloodshed. Just the villain. Now, let us talk about Margaret of Anjou, because if you think Isabella got unfair treatment from history, wait until you hear what they did to Margaret. Margaret was born in 1430, the daughter of René of Anjou, a minor French noble with grand titles but very little money or power. And in 1445 she was married to King Henry VI of England as part of a peace deal to end the 100 Years' War. She was 15 years old, Henry was 23, and unlike Edward II, Henry was not cruel or corrupt or infatuated with favourites. He was worse. He was incompetent, possibly mentally ill, sweet, pious, gentle, completely unfit to rule. Henry VI was known for his devotion to religion and education. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, which is lovely. But he was a terrible king. He had no political sense, no military ability, no backbone. He let his advisors manipulate him. He made disastrous decisions, and worst of all, he suffered from episodes of complete mental breakdown. In 1453, he had a catastrophic mental collapse. He became catatonic. He could not speak, could not recognize people, could not function. For over a year, the King of England was essentially a living statue, and somebody had to actually govern the kingdom. That somebody was Margaret. She had to be. She had just given birth to a son, Edward, which meant the succession was finally secure. But her husband was incapacitated, and there were powerful nobles, particularly Richard, Duke of York, who had their own claims to the throne and were circling like sharks. If Margaret did not act, did not take control, did not protect her infant son's inheritance, the Yorkist faction would seize power. So she did what she had to do. She became the political leader of the Lancastrian faction. She negotiated. She made alliances. She raised armies. She fought. And the chroniclers hated her for it. They said she was too involved in politics, that she was domineering, that she controlled her weak husband and usurped male authority. One contemporary source describes her as having a great and strong-laboured mind, but then immediately adds that she had a man's spirit in her, as if being politically capable meant she was not properly female. Another calls her an unprincipled woman for daring to lead armies during the Wars of the Roses. But what was she supposed to do? Her husband was mentally ill. Her son was a child. If she did not fight, they would lose everything. For 15 years, from 1455 to 1471, Margaret of Anjou was one of the primary military and political leaders in the Wars of the Roses, the brutal civil war between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions for control of the English throne. She commanded armies. She negotiated with foreign powers, France, Scotland, trying to get support. She won battles, she lost battles, she was exiled, returned, exiled again. She was captured, imprisoned, ransomed. Her husband was eventually murdered. Her son was killed in battle. And through all of it, Margaret never stopped fighting. But here is what history remembers. Not her courage, not her strategic thinking, not her absolute refusal to give up even when everything was lost. History remembers her as the ambitious queen who caused the Wars of the Roses, as if the conflict was her fault, as if powerful men had not been fighting over the throne for generations before she arrived, as if her crime was not starting the war but daring to participate in it. There is a moment in 1471 that encapsulates Margaret's tragedy. Her forces had just lost the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her son Edward, the boy she had fought for all these years, was killed in the battle at age 17. Her cause was finished. The Yorkists had won, and Margaret was captured. She was paraded through London as a captive, a humiliated queen, proof of Yorkist victory. And then she was imprisoned for 4 years before being ransomed by the French king and allowed to return to France, where she lived in poverty until her death in 1482. Do you know what they wrote about her after she died? The Yorkist chronicles described her as a monster, a warmongering fury, an unnatural woman who dragged England into bloodshed. The Duke of York and later his son Edward IV, who became king, they were described as righteous, justified, bringing peace after Margaret's chaos. The double standard is breathtaking. When men fight for power, for thrones, for their family's inheritance, they are brave, they are honourable, they are doing their duty. When Margaret did exactly the same thing, she was a dangerous woman who refused to know her place. And here is the saddest parallel between Isabella and Margaret. Both of them were married to kings who were fundamentally unable to rule. Edward II was incompetent and distracted. Henry VI was literally mentally incapacitated. And both queens stepped into the power vacuum because somebody had to. Somebody had to actually govern, somebody had to make decisions, and because they were women doing it, they were vilified. If there had been male regents, brothers or uncles of the king, their leadership would have been praised. But as wives, as women, they were threatening the natural order just by being competent. There is a medieval political theorist named Christine de Pizan, one of the first professional female writers in European history, who wrote in the early 1400s about the double bind facing powerful women. She said that if a woman is gentle and passive, she is dismissed as weak and ineffective. But if she is strong and active, she is condemned as masculine and unnatural. There is no winning, the game is rigged, and Isabella and Margaret both discover this the hard way. What strikes me most about their stories is how similar they are despite being separated by more than a century. Both were French princesses married to English kings, both had to deal with incompetent husbands, both took political and military action to protect themselves and their children. Both were eventually defeated and removed from power, and both were turned into cautionary tales, examples of what happens when women are too ambitious, too political, too unwilling to accept their subordinate place. But let us be clear about what they actually did. Isabella of France overthrew a tyrannical, incompetent king and stabilised England under her regency until her son was old enough to rule on his own. That is not villainy. That is effective governance. Margaret of Anjou fought for 15 years to protect her son's inheritance against powerful nobles who wanted to seize the throne. That is not grasping ambition. That is a mother and a queen doing her duty. The fact that both of them have been remembered as she-wolves, as dangerous women, as villains, tells us everything about how history treats women who refuse to be passive. They are not allowed to be complex political actors. They cannot be both ambitious and right. They cannot be both powerful and good. They have to be simplified, reduced to archetypes. The bad wife, the overreaching queen, the woman who wanted too much. And this pattern, this insistence on punishing women for ambition, for political involvement, for refusing to stay quiet, this did not end in medieval Europe. It continues. We see it in how female politicians today are described as shrill, as nasty, as too ambitious. We see it in the way that powerful women are held to different standards than powerful men. judged more harshly for the same behaviors, criticized for being both too soft and too hard, too feminine and too masculine. The language has changed, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Women who seek power are threatening and they must be punished for it. But what if we refuse to accept that narrative? What if we look at Isabella and Margaret and see not villains but survivors? Women who are handed impossible situations and did the best they could with the tools available to them. What if we acknowledge that yes, they were ambitious, and ambition in pursuit of survival, in pursuit of protecting your children, in pursuit of effective governance is not a sin? What if we grant them the same complexity, the same moral ambiguity, the same historical respect that we give to ambitious men? Because here is the truth that makes their erasure and vilification so important to challenge. These women were not aberrations, they were not exceptions. Throughout history, in every culture, there have been women who stepped into power when circumstances demanded it. Some ruled openly, some ruled from behind the scenes. Some were celebrated in their time and erased later. Some were vilified immediately. But they were always there, always participating, always shaping events. And the fact that we have to work so hard to recover their stories, the fact that they keep disappearing from the historical narrative, is not an accident. It is a choice made over and over again to centre men's stories and marginalise women's. But while European queens were being erased through vilification, being turned into cautionary tales about ambitious women, something even more insidious was happening on the other side of the world. In China, in the very heart of the Forbidden City, there was a place where powerful women were sent to be forgotten, not killed, not exiled to distant lands, just set aside, made invisible, locked away in golden cages where they would live out their lives in luxury and complete powerlessness, disappearing from history while still technically alive. Let me take you into the palace of forgotten favourites, and show you how empires made women vanish without ever touching them. Imagine living in the most beautiful prison in the world. Your cage is made of gold, jade, and silk. You have servants attending to your every need. You eat the finest foods, wear the most exquisite clothes, live surrounded by art and luxury that most people could never dream of. And yet you cannot leave. You cannot make decisions. You cannot see your children. You cannot participate in the world beyond your walls. You are alive, but you have been erased from life itself. Welcome to the palace of forgotten favourites, and welcome to one of history's most elegant and cruel methods of making powerful women disappear. The Forbidden City in Beijing was the heart of Chinese imperial power for nearly 500 years, from 1420 to 1912. It covers 72 hectares, that is about 178 acres, of buildings, gardens, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces. And within that vast complex, there was a specific palace, a specific set of buildings, designated for women who'd been powerful but were powerful no longer, empresses who had been deposed, concubines who had fallen from favour, dowager empresses whose sons had died or been replaced. These women were sent to live in comfortable, beautiful, complete isolation. They were not killed. They were not publicly humiliated. They were simply put away, made invisible. And their stories, their voices, their very existence was erased from the active life of the empire. The phrase palace of forgotten favourites is almost poetic, is it not? It sounds romantic, melancholy, like something from a fairy tale, but the reality was suffocating. These women, many of whom had wielded enormous influence, who had made political decisions, who had controlled access to the emperor, who had been mothers of princes and advisors to emperors, were reduced to living ghosts. They existed in a liminal space, not dead, but not really alive, not punished, but not free, not dishonored publicly, but completely erased from the historical narrative. Let us talk about how this system worked, because the Chinese imperial harem was not just a collection of the emperor's wives and concubines. It was a massive bureaucracy, a hierarchy as complex and structured as the government itself. At the top was the empress, the official wife of the emperor. Below her were ranked consorts, imperial noble consort, consort, imperial concubine, and so on down through 8 or more ranks. Each rank had specific privileges, specific duties, specific clothing they could wear, specific colours of silk, specific styles of jewellery. Everything was regulated, everything was hierarchical, everything was about knowing your place. And here is the cruel irony. The women in the harem spent their entire lives trying to climb that hierarchy, trying to gain the emperor's favour, trying to give birth to sons who might become the next emperor, trying to position themselves for power. Because if your son became emperor, you became the Empress Dowager, one of the most powerful positions in the entire empire. You could influence policy, control appointments, effectively rule from behind the scenes. The most famous example is Empress Dowager Cixi, who controlled the Qing dynasty for nearly 50 years in the late 1800s and early 1900s. She was never officially the emperor, but she ruled China through a combination of political brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. But for every Cixi who managed to hold on to power, there were dozens of women who lost it. And when you lost power in the imperial harem, when you were no longer useful or when you became inconvenient, you were sent away. Not expelled from the palace entirely, that would be too scandalous, too much of an admission that the emperor had made a mistake in choosing you. No, you were moved to the inner apartments, to the forgotten palaces, where you would live out your days in luxury and obscurity. One of the most heartbreaking examples is Empress Wang, the first wife of Emperor Gaozong of the Tang dynasty. Yes, the same Emperor Gaozong we talked about when discussing Wu Zetian. Empress Wang was from an aristocratic family, carefully chosen to be empress, educated and cultured, and everything an empress was supposed to be. But she failed at the one thing that mattered most. She did not give Gaozong a son. And when Wu Zetian, who was just a low-ranking concubine at the time, caught the emperor's attention and did give birth to sons, Empress Wang's position became precarious. According to the histories, and remember, these histories were written by people who hated Wu Zetian, so we have to read them skeptically, Wu framed Empress Wang for murdering Wu's own infant daughter. Whether that is true or propaganda we cannot know, but the result was that in 605 Empress Wang was deposed. She was stripped of her title, her rank, her position, and she was imprisoned in a remote part of the palace, along with the emperor's former favourite concubine Xiao Shufei, who had also opposed Wu. The sources tell us that Wu had both women beaten, their hands and feet cut off, and then they were thrown into wine vats to die. It is a horrific story, but historians have questioned whether this actually happened or whether it is propaganda designed to make Wu seem monstrous. What we do know is that Empress Wang disappeared from the historical record after being deposed. She was erased. Whether she died quickly and violently or lived for years in isolated imprisonment, she was gone. Her story ended the moment she lost power, and this pattern repeated throughout Chinese imperial history. When an empress was deposed, and it happened regularly, for reasons ranging from political intrigue to infertility to simply annoying the emperor, she was moved to a remote palace. Sometimes literally called Palace of the Deposed Empress, she would be given a new, lower title. She would be attended by servants, but she would be cut off from her family, from political life, from any chance of influence. She would live, perhaps for decades, knowing that she had been erased from the active world while still breathing. Think about the psychological torture of that. You are 30 years old, maybe 40. You were the Empress of China, one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold in the entire world. And now you are sitting in a beautiful room with nothing to do but embroider, paint, write poetry that no one will read, and wait to die. Your children, if you had them, have been taken from you, raised by other women. Your political influence is gone. Your husband, the emperor, has moved on to a new favourite and might never think of you again. You are not dead, but you are not alive. You're forgotten. There is a Chinese historian named Brett Hinch who has written about the lives of imperial women, and he makes this observation that has haunted me. The harem system was designed to make women compete with each other for male attention and approval, which prevented them from forming alliances that might threaten male power. Every woman was a rival to every other woman. Your success meant another woman's failure, and this system kept women isolated, suspicious of each other, unable to organize collectively. The palace might have housed thousands of women, but each of them was alone. And when you lost the competition, when you were no longer useful, you were sent to live with other forgotten women in the forgotten palaces. And there is something particularly cruel about that, is there not? You are surrounded by people who understand exactly what you have lost, who are living the same erasure, the same isolation. But you cannot bond with them because the system has trained you to see other women as enemies, as competition. So you live in proximity but not in solidarity, all of you disappearing together but separately. Now, not all deposed empresses were physically imprisoned or hidden away. Some were given the option to voluntarily become Buddhist nuns, which was a socially acceptable way of removing them from political life while maintaining faith. They would go to a convent, shave their heads, take vows, and spend the rest of their lives in religious seclusion. This was supposed to be honourable, spiritual, a respectable retirement. But let us be honest about what it really was. It was another way of erasing women who had become inconvenient. You cannot influence politics from a convent. You cannot raise your sons to claim power. You cannot make alliances or build support. You are removed, set aside, forgotten. And the thing is, we do not have their stories. We do not have memoirs from the palace of forgotten favourites. We do not have letters or diaries or first-hand accounts of what it was like to live that way. The women who were sent there disappeared so completely that we do not even know most of their names. The official histories mention them only in passing, if at all. The former empress was moved to the Eastern Palace and lived there in seclusion until her death. That is it, one sentence. An entire life, reduced to a bureaucratic notation. But occasionally, very rarely, a voice breaks through the silence. There are poems, fragments of poems, attributed to deposed concubines or forgotten empresses. They are heartbreaking. One poem supposedly written by a concubine who had fallen from favour describes sitting by a window watching the seasons change, knowing that she will never leave this room, that she is watching life go by from a distance. Another describes the sound of laughter from the parts of the palace where the current favourites live, and how that laughter is more painful than silence because it reminds her of what she has lost. These poems might not be authentic. They might have been written by male poets and attributed to palace women as a literary convention. But even if they are not real, they tell us something true, that the suffering of forgotten women was known, was acknowledged, and was used as material for art and sympathy by the very culture that created the system that caused that suffering. There is something particularly grotesque about that. The culture that locked women away then wrote sad poems about how tragic their isolation was, as if it was some kind of natural disaster rather than a deliberately maintained system of control. Let me tell you about one empress whose story we do know a little bit about, because she was deposed in a particularly dramatic and well-documented way. Her name was Empress Guo, and she was the wife of Emperor Guangwu of the Han Dynasty, who ruled from 25 to 50 CE. Empress Guo had been Guangwu's companion during the wars that brought him to power. She had supported him, advised him, been with him through the dangerous years of rebellion and conquest. And when he became emperor, he made her empress. But she did not give him sons. Another woman, Consort Yin, did, and Yin was beautiful, educated, from a good family, and most importantly, she was the mother of the crown prince. So in 41 CE, Emperor Guangwu made a cold political calculation. He deposed Empress Guo and made Consort Yin the new empress, and the sources tell us that this was devastating to Guo. She had given up everything to support Guangwu, she had been loyal through wars and upheavals, and in return, she was set aside because she had not produced the right kind of heir. She was moved to a remote palace, given a lesser title, and lived in isolation for another 16 years until her death in 52 CE. What did she do for those 16 years? What did she think about? Did she rage against the injustice? Did she accept it as the inevitable working of fate? Did she try to maintain dignity and grace? Or did she break under the loneliness? We do not know. All we know is that she was empress, and then she was not, and then she disappeared from history except for a few mentions in the official records. And Empress Guo is one of the lucky ones in a sense, because at least we know her name, at least her story was recorded, even if only in outline. There are dozens, probably hundreds of women in Chinese imperial history who were sent to forgotten palaces and whose names we do not even know. They were just a former consort, or a deposed empress, or a palace woman who had lost favour. Not people, not individuals with stories and feelings and voices, just categories, just problems that had been solved by removal and erasure. Now, let us zoom out and think about what this system represents on a larger scale. The Palace of Forgotten Favourites was not unique to China. The concept of removing inconvenient royal women from public life and confining them in luxurious isolation appears in many cultures. European convents served a similar function. When a medieval princess or queen became inconvenient, too political, too ambitious, too much of a reminder of a previous regime, she could be encouraged to retire to a convent. Ottoman harems had similar dynamics, with out-of-favour concubines and mother sultans being sent to live in the old palace, separated from the centre of power. What all these systems have in common is that they allow societies to erase powerful women without the scandal and instability of killing them outright. It is a gentler form of erasure, but it is erasure nonetheless. You do not have to execute someone to remove them from history. You just have to isolate them so completely that they cannot participate in public life, cannot influence events, cannot leave records of their existence. And then you wait for them to die, and when they do, you write one sentence about them in the official history, if you bother to write anything at all. And here is what makes me angriest about this system. It is invisible violence. There is no blood. There is no dramatic execution. There is just a woman being moved from one beautiful palace to another. Beautiful palace. And if you're not paying close attention, if you're not asking questions about where she went and why, and what her life is like now, you might not even notice that she has disappeared. The system is designed to make the erasure seem natural, inevitable, even kind. She is living comfortably in retirement. She has chosen a life of religious contemplation. She is in seclusion for her own safety and peace. But underneath those euphemisms is imprisonment, is silencing, is the deliberate destruction of a person's agency and voice and presence in the world. And because it is done quietly, beautifully, without overt violence, It is harder to condemn, harder to resist, harder to even recognize as the injustice that it is. We have spent this entire journey learning about royal women who disappeared from history through various means. Some were slandered and demonized. Some were physically killed or vanished mysteriously. Some were written out of the historical record through simple neglect and disinterest in women's stories. But the palace of forgotten favourites represents something different. Systematic, institutional disappearance. A bureaucratized method of erasing women that was so normalized, so accepted, that it continued for centuries without anyone thinking it was wrong. And that normalization is perhaps the most insidious part. When erasure is exceptional, when it is dramatic, people notice. People ask questions. But when erasure is routine, when it is just how the system works, when everyone accepts that of course out-of-favour empresses go to the forgotten palaces because where else would they go, then the erasure becomes invisible. It becomes part of the background of how the world works. And the women who are being erased cannot even point to it as injustice because they are told and maybe even believe that this is just the natural order of things. But it is not natural. It is constructed. It is chosen. Every system that disappears women, that silences them, that removes them from public life and political participation, is a choice that was made and that continues to be made every time the system is maintained without question or challenge. And understanding that is crucial because it means these systems can be challenged, can be changed, can be dismantled. As we near the end of our journey through these disappeared queens and forgotten empresses, we need to step back and ask the bigger questions. Why does this keep happening? What are the patterns that connect Theodora of Byzantium to Wu Zetian of China to Nzinga of Angola to the unnamed women locked in forgotten palaces? What do all these stories tell us about power, gender, and the writing of history? And most importantly, what can we do to make sure these women, and the countless others who have been erased, are remembered and reclaimed? Let me show you the patterns that history tried to hide, and what they reveal about who gets to be remembered and why. When you look at all these stories together, when you step back and see Theodora of Byzantium, Empress Matilda of England, Queen Nzinga of Angola, Kandake Amanirinas of Kush, Queen Amina of Zaozao, Wu Zetian of China, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, and the countless unnamed women locked in forgotten palaces, a pattern emerges, and it is not a coincidence. It is not bad luck. It is not that these particular women just happen to be difficult or controversial or unlucky in how history treated them. This is systematic, this is deliberate, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. So let us name it. Let us pull it into the light and examine exactly how history has been weaponized to erase powerful women. The first pattern is what I call the rhetoric of the unnatural woman. Every single culture we have examined tonight has a version of this. In Byzantium, powerful women were called haughty and scheming. In China, they were demons who violated the natural order. In medieval Europe, they were she-wolves and had man's spirit in them, as if being politically competent meant they were not really women. In Africa, colonial chroniclers painted warrior queens as bloodthirsty savages to justify conquest. Notice the pattern. When a woman succeeds in politics, in warfare, in governance, the response is not to acknowledge her competence. The response is to question her femininity, her humanity, her very naturalness as a being. This is not descriptive language. This is prescriptive. These words are not trying to describe what these women were actually like. They are trying to enforce what women should be like by punishing those who deviate. It is a warning system. Look what we call women who try to hold power. Look how we remember them. Demon, monster, she-wolf, haughty, unnatural. Do you want to be remembered that way? Then stay quiet. Stay small, know your place. And this rhetoric is incredibly effective because it is unfalsifiable. If you are a powerful woman and you are gentle and kind, you are weak and unsuited for leadership. If you are strong and decisive, you are mannish and unnatural. If you show emotion, you're hysterical. If you do not show emotion, you are cold and inhuman. There is no way to win. The language shifts to ensure that no matter what you do, you can be criticized for it. The game is rigged at the level of vocabulary itself. The historian Judith Bennett has written about what she calls the patriarchal equilibrium. This idea that even as specific laws and customs change over time, the fundamental power imbalance between men and women remains remarkably stable across centuries. And one of the ways that equilibrium is maintained is through language. By controlling how we talk about powerful women, by ensuring that the words available to describe them are almost all negative or diminishing, history keeps the power structure intact. You can have individual exceptional women who break through, but they will be described in ways that make them seem like aberrations, exceptions, freaks of nature, rather than evidence that women as a class are capable of wielding power. The second pattern is what I call strategic amnesia. This is when powerful women are not vilified but simply forgotten, not written about, not taught, not passed down in cultural memory. We saw this with the Kandaks of Kush, with Queen Amina of Zazao, with Princess Marjorie Bruce, with so many others. Their accomplishments were real. The evidence exists. Pyramids, walls, documents, archaeological remains. But they were not included in the narrative that was taught as world history, or even national history. They were left out. And that leaving out is not passive, it is active. Somebody has to decide what goes in the textbook, what gets taught in schools, what becomes common knowledge. And for centuries, those somebodies were European and American men who had very specific ideas about whose stories mattered. Here is a question that should make you uncomfortable. How many of the women we talked about tonight had you heard of before? I would guess that most people watching this have heard of Cleopatra, maybe Wu Zetian if they studied Asian history, possibly Elizabeth III or Catherine the Great if we were covering different time periods. But Candaceia Manirenas, Queen Zinga, Empress Matilda, who almost became England's first ruling queen, Queen Amina, who built an empire in West Africa. These should be household names. These should be taught alongside Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan. But they are not. And that is strategic amnesia. The excuse given is usually that the sources are insufficient, that we do not have enough information, that the historical record is incomplete. And sometimes that is true. But here is the thing. We have incomplete records for lots of male historical figures too, and that has never stopped us from teaching about them. We have far more archaeological evidence for the Kandaks than we do for many ancient Greek or Roman figures, and yet they are not in the textbooks. We have detailed chronicles about Margaret of Anjou's military campaigns, but she is remembered as a footnote to the Wars of the Roses, not as a central military leader. The standard of evidence required to include women in history is consistently higher than the standard required to include men, and when women are included, there is a third pattern: reduction to relationships. Look at the epitaph on Empress Matilda's tomb: daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. Nothing about her own accomplishments, just her relationships to men. Or think about how Queen Nzinga is often introduced as the queen who used her attendant as a chair, rather than the military strategist who fought Portugal for 40 years. One is a colourful anecdote about a woman doing something unusual. The other is a serious historical achievement that should command respect. Guess which one gets repeated more often? This pattern appears everywhere. Women are the wife of, the daughter of, the mother of. They are adjuncts to male stories, not protagonists of their own. And even when their own stories are told, they are often framed through their relationships with men. Was Theodora truly in love with Justinian? Did Wu Zetian seduce her way to power? Was Isabella of France's affair with Mortimer about love or politics? These questions center male-female relationships and romantic intrigue instead of focusing on what these women actually did, what they accomplished, what political strategies they employed. Now here is the sneaky part of this pattern. It feels natural. It feels like we're just acknowledging important context, talking about their personal lives, being interested in the human element of history. But notice that we do not do this to the same degree with men. We do not introduce Julius Caesar as the husband of Calpurnia and lover of Cleopatra before we talk about his military campaigns. We do not summarize Napoleon's legacy as son of Carlo Buonaparte, husband of Josephine and Marie-Louise. For men, personal relationships are context. For women, personal relationships become the story. And that reduction serves to keep women in the domestic sphere even when they are operating in the political and military spheres. The fourth pattern is the multiplication of standards. We touched on this with the double bind of ambition, but it goes deeper. Powerful women throughout history have been held to contradictory and impossible standards. They must be strong but not aggressive, intelligent but not threatening, beautiful but not vain, maternal but not weak, decisive but not domineering. And they must achieve all of this while also being better than equivalent men just to be considered equal. Think about Wu Zetian. The crime she is accused of, political murders, eliminating rivals, using violence to maintain power. These are things that virtually every emperor in Chinese history did. But when men did them, they were described as strong rulers making tough decisions. When Wu did them, she was a demon. The standard shifted. The same behaviour judged completely differently based on gender. Or think about Margaret of Anjou and Isabella of France. Both were accused of being too involved in politics, of overstepping their roles as queen's consort. But their husbands were incompetent. Somebody had to govern. If male regents had stepped in, brothers or uncles of weak kings, they would have been praised for their loyalty and capability. But as wives doing the exact same thing, Margaret and Isabella were condemned for being unnatural, for grasping at power that was not theirs. The standard for acceptable behaviour was different for them precisely because they were women. And this multiplication of standards is exhausting, right? Because you can never meet them all. You can never be everything that is demanded of you when the demands are contradictory, and that is the point. The standards are designed to be impossible to meet so that powerful women can always be criticised, can always be found wanting, can always be dismissed as not quite good enough, not quite legitimate, not quite deserving of the power they hold. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the most insidious, is what I call isolation and competition. This is the system we saw most clearly in the Chinese imperial harem, but it appears in different forms across cultures. The basic principle is this: keep women from forming alliances with each other. Keep them competing for male attention and approval. Keep them seeing each other as rivals, rather than as potential allies. Because isolated women can be controlled. Women in solidarity cannot. In the harem system, every woman was competing with every other woman for the emperor's favour, for status, for the security of having her son named crown prince. In European courts, queen consorts and royal mistresses were often pitted against each other, with courtiers and male politicians exploiting those rivalries to their own advantage. And in the historical record itself, we often see powerful women being compared unfavourably to each other. The good queen who knew her place versus the bad queen who was too ambitious. The pious saint versus the scheming politician. These comparisons discourage women from identifying with each other, from seeing shared struggles and shared barriers. And here is what is brilliant and terrible about this pattern. It works. Throughout history, we can find examples of powerful women who did not support other women, who participated in the systems that oppressed women because they had carved out their own exceptional status and did not want to risk it by challenging the system. Empress Euphemia trying to block Theodora's marriage. Queen mothers in various cultures enforcing strict harem rules on younger women. European queens opposing female inheritance rights because it would threaten their sons' claims to thrones. When women are isolated from each other and competing within a patriarchal system, they sometimes become enforcers of that system themselves. But what is also important to note is that this is not women's fault. This is what happens when you design a system where the only path to safety or power or even survival for women is through male favour, and where there are very few positions available, so women have to compete for them. The problem is not that women are naturally catty or competitive. The problem is that the system is deliberately designed to make them that way, and recognizing that is crucial because it means that when we find examples of women who did support each other, who did form alliances, who did work together across lines of rank and status, those examples are revolutionary acts of resistance against a system designed to keep them apart. Now we need to talk about the people who did the erasing, who wrote the histories, who created these patterns and maintained them for centuries. Who were they, and why did they do it? The answer is simpler and more obvious than you might think. They were men who held power and wanted to keep it. Historians, chroniclers, bishops, officials, poets, playwrights, the people with access to education, with the ability to write and have their writings preserved, were almost exclusively male, and they wrote from within patriarchal systems that gave them status and authority. They benefited from the idea that men were natural leaders and women were not, but it was not always conscious conspiracy. Sometimes, probably most of the time, it was unconscious bias. It was assuming that, of course, the emperor's accomplishments mattered more than the empress's. Of course, the king's military campaigns were more important than the queen's political manoeuvring. Of course, male scholars and officials were more reliable sources than female poets and letter writers. These biases were baked into the culture, into the language, into the entire framework of how history was conceived and written. So even well-meaning chroniclers, even relatively sympathetic historians, would unconsciously center men's stories and marginalize women's. And then there were the deliberate acts of propaganda and character assassination. The men who wrote the secret history tearing down Theodora, the Confucian scholars who spent centuries demonizing Wu Zetian, the Yorkist chroniclers who painted Margaret of Anjou as a warmongering fury, the Portuguese and missionary sources that portrayed Nzinga as a cannibal and a savage. These were not accidents. These were deliberate attempts to destroy the reputations of women who had threatened male power, to ensure that their stories would serve as warnings rather than as inspiration. But here is where I want to offer a tiny bit of hope, a small crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of historical erasure. These patterns, as powerful as they are, as persistent as they have been across centuries and cultures, are not natural laws. They are human constructions, and what humans have built, humans can dismantle. The reason we know about these patterns now, the reason I can stand here and name them and analyze them, is because scholars, many of them women, many of them people of color, many of them people who've been historically marginalized themselves, have done the work of recovery. They have gone back to the archives. They have learned languages that few people study. They have questioned the traditional narratives and asked, where are the women? What happened to them? Why were they erased? And they are finding answers. They are recovering voices. They are publishing books and articles and documentaries that are slowly, painfully slowly, but surely changing what we know about history. Theodora is being re-evaluated. Wu Zetian is being reconsidered. The Kandaks are being taught. Nzinga is being celebrated. The work is happening. The patterns are being exposed. And once you see the pattern, once you understand how it works, you can never look at history the same way again. You start to ask different questions. When you read a history book and it is all about kings and emperors and generals, you ask, where are the women? Who is missing from this story? When you encounter a bad queen or a wicked empress, you ask, who wrote this? What do they have to gain from portraying her this way? What is the evidence and what is propaganda? When entire civilizations are left out of world history curricula, you ask, why? Who decided that these stories do not matter? Who benefited from that decision? And these questions are not just about the past. They are about the present and the future. Because the patterns that erased women from history are still operating today. The language has changed. We do not call powerful women demons anymore usually, but the underlying dynamics are similar. Women in politics are still described as shrill, nasty, ambitious in ways that men are not. Women's accomplishments are still reduced to their relationships, their appearance, their likability. Women who compete with each other are still portrayed as catfights, rather than as legitimate political or professional rivalry. The multiplication of standards, the impossible demands, the isolation, it all continues. But knowing the historical patterns, understanding how they worked and why they were created, gives us tools to recognize and resist them in the present. When we see a powerful woman being torn down, being called unnatural or too ambitious, we can recognize that as an old tactic, a pattern that has been used for centuries to keep women out of power. And we can refuse to participate in it. We can ask better questions. We can demand better evidence. We can insist on complexity and nuance instead of accepting simple narratives about good queens and bad queens, natural women and unnatural ones. And that brings us to the final part of our journey. We have met the women who were erased. We have seen the patterns of how they were erased. But what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor these women? How do we make sure that their stories and the stories of countless others still waiting to be recovered are not forgotten again? How do we change the way we think about history, power, and the women who have always been part of shaping our world even when they were written out of the official story? Let me show you what reclamation looks like and why it matters so much, not just for understanding the past, but for creating a different future. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the shadows where history hid its queens. We have walked through Byzantine palaces and Scottish castles, through West African kingdoms and Chinese forbidden cities, through battlefields and convents and gilded cages. We have met women who commanded armies, negotiated with empires, ruled nations, and changed the course of history. And we have seen again and again how those women were erased, diminished, vilified, or simply forgotten. But tonight is not just about mourning what was lost. Tonight is about reclamation, about recovery, about the extraordinary work being done right now in our lifetime to bring these women back into the light. Let me tell you about a discovery that happened in 2008 in the city of Magdeburg, Germany. Archaeologists opened a tomb in the cathedral, a tomb that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. Inside, they found a lead casket containing human remains, and through a combination of carbon dating, isotopic analysis, and historical detective work, they were able to confirm something remarkable. These were the bones of Queen Edgith, the daughter of King Edward the Elder of England, who married the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV in 929. She died in 946, and here she was, more than a millennium later, finally identified, finally known. But here is the strange part. Not all of Edgith was in that casket. Her hands and feet were missing. Most of her skull was gone. and historians believe these pieces were taken as holy relics, scattered across Europe, venerated and eventually lost. So even in death, even in the physical remains, Eadgyth was fragmented, scattered, incomplete. But the fact that we found her at all, that we can now say with scientific certainty, this woman existed, this was her body, this is proof of her life, that matters, that is reclamation. Or think about 1991, when workers in Yekaterinburg, Russia, discovered a mass grave in a forest. Inside were the remains of what appeared to be a family, 2 adults, 3 young women, and fragments of others. For years there was speculation, debate, competing claims. Could this be the Romanov family, executed by Bolsheviks in 1918? In 1998, DNA testing confirmed it. These were the bones of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, and in 2007 more remains were found and confirmed as the other 2 children, Alexei and Anastasia. For 70 years there had been legends about Anastasia escaping, about her surviving the execution. Multiple women claimed to be her. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who insisted until her death in 1984 that she was the lost Grand Duchess, but DNA does not lie. Anastasia died with her family in 1918. She did not escape. She did not disappear into a new life. And while that is a tragic conclusion, there is something important about having that conclusion, about being able to say definitively, this is what happened. No more mystery, no more exploitation of that mystery, just truth, recovered from bones and science. These discoveries matter because they move women's stories from the realm of legend and speculation into the realm of documented fact. You cannot argue with DNA. You cannot dismiss isotopic evidence as probably exaggerated or potentially biased, the way you can dismiss chronicles written by hostile historians. Science gives us a different kind of proof, and that proof is powerful. But physical remains are only one kind of recovery. Perhaps even more important is the work being done by historians, particularly feminist historians and scholars from historically marginalized communities, to reread old sources, to ask new questions, and to recover women's voices from archives that have always contained them, but that no one bothered to look at properly. There is a historian named Linda Hayward, whose book Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, has fundamentally changed how we understand Queen Nzinga. Hayward went back to the Portuguese and missionary sources that have always been our primary records of Nzinga's life, but instead of reading them as objective truth, she read them critically, asking, what biases do these writers have? What agenda are they serving? What are they leaving out? And by reading the same sources with different questions, she was able to construct a much more nuanced, much more accurate picture of who Nzinga was. Not a demon, not a saint, but a brilliant, pragmatic political and military leader navigating impossible circumstances. Or think about the work being done on Wuzitian. For over 1,000 years she was portrayed almost exclusively through the lens of the Confucian scholars who despised her. But modern Chinese historians, and particularly female scholars, have gone back to the administrative records, the economic data, the archaeological evidence of her reign, and what they've found is that her rule was actually quite successful. The economy grew, the empire expanded, the civil service became more meritocratic. These are facts, measurable outcomes, and they tell a very different story than the one about the demon empress who destroyed the natural order. And this work of recovery is not just happening in academia. It is happening in popular culture, in ways that make these stories accessible to millions of people who will never read an academic journal. In 2023, Netflix released African Queens Njinga, a docudrama that brought Queen Nzinga's story to a global audience. Is it perfect? No. Is it sometimes dramatized in ways that prioritize entertainment over strict historical accuracy? Yes. But it is introducing millions of people to a woman they had never heard of, and that matters. That is how cultural memory shifts. There are novels being written about forgotten queens, historical fiction that imagines the inner lives of women we have only a few facts about. Some people criticize this as making things up, as not being real history. But I would argue that imaginative reconstruction, when it is grounded in research and honest about what is speculation, serves an important purpose. It reminds us that these women were people. They had thoughts, feelings, fears, hopes. They were not just names in chronicles. They were human beings who loved and suffered and made choices. And fiction can access that humanity in ways that academic writing sometimes cannot. There are museums changing their exhibits. The British Museum, which holds that bronze head of Augustus, that Candace Amanirenas' people buried under their temple steps, now tells that story in the exhibit. It is no longer just Roman bronze head 1st century BCE. It is Roman bronze head, looted by Kushite forces under Queen Amanirenas and buried as an act of defiance. The framing matters, the context matters. The same object tells a completely different story depending on whose perspective you center. There are educators demanding changes to curricula. History teachers who are tired of teaching the same old narratives about great men and their wars are incorporating lessons about Empress Matilda, about the Kandakis, about Queen Amina. Not as special one-off lessons during Women's History Month, but as integral parts of medieval history, of world history, of military history. Because these women were not tangential to history, they were history. And there is social media, which for all its flaws, has created spaces where historians and history enthusiasts can share these stories widely and quickly. There are Instagram accounts dedicated to forgotten queens, YouTube channels like this one, that are telling these stories to audiences who would never pick up an academic book but who are hungry for narratives that challenge what they were taught in school. TikTok historians doing 60-second summaries of complex historical figures and making people curious enough to learn more. This is democratizing historical knowledge in ways that were impossible even 20 years ago. But here is what I want to emphasize as we come to the end of this journey. Reclamation is not just about adding women to the existing narrative. It is about changing the narrative itself. It is about questioning what we think history is, what we think it is for, whose stories we think matter, and why. For too long, history has been taught as if it is the story of great men, their conquests, their wars, their laws, their ideas. And women appear only as wives, mothers, lovers, victims, or occasional exceptions that prove the rule. But what if history is actually the story of how human societies organize themselves, how they distribute power and resources, how they decide who gets to make decisions and who has to obey them? If that is what history is, then women are not peripheral to that story. Women are central to it. Because every society has had to answer the question, what do we do about women? How much power can they have? What roles can they play? And the answers to those questions have shaped everything: laws, religions, economies, wars, art, science, everything. When we recover the stories of powerful women, when we stop treating them as exceptions and start treating them as evidence of what women have always been capable of when given the opportunity, we are not just adding diversity to history, we are fundamentally changing our understanding of what humans are capable of, what societies can be, what power looks like and who can wield it. And that has implications for the present and the future. When young girls learn that women have always been leaders, warriors, strategists, rulers, not just occasionally, not just as rare exceptions, but consistently across time and geography, it changes what they believe is possible for themselves. When young boys learn the same thing, it changes what they expect from the women in their lives and from society as a whole. History is not just about the past. It is about shaping how we imagine the future. Let me tell you something I've learned in researching these stories. The women we talked about tonight, Theodora, Matilda, the Scottish queens, Nzinga, Amanirenas, Amina, Wuzetian, the vanished princesses, Isabella, Margaret, the forgotten empresses in their gilded cages, they would have known each other's stories were impossible. They lived in different centuries, different continents, different cultures, but they all faced the same fundamental challenge: how to wield power in a world that insists women cannot and should not have it. And they all found ways to do it anyway. Some succeeded for a while and then were crushed. Some succeeded and were erased afterward. Some built legacies that lasted for generations even though their names were forgotten. But they all tried. They all refused to accept that their gender made them incapable. They all insisted, through their actions if not their words, that they belonged in the rooms where decisions were made, on the battlefields where wars were fought, on the thrones where nations were ruled. And the fact that history tried so hard to erase them, to diminish them, to turn them into villains and warnings and forgotten footnotes, that tells us how threatening they were, how dangerous their examples were, how much the people in power feared that if women knew about Theodora's intelligence and Nzinga's military genius and Wuzetian's administrative reforms and Amina's conquests, they might start to think, if they could do it, why can't I? And that is exactly what I want you to think. If you are a woman watching this, I want you to know that women have always been powerful, have always been capable, have always participated in shaping the world. The fact that you were not taught about it does not mean it did not happen. It just means someone decided you should not know, and now you do, and you cannot unknow it. And I hope that knowledge changes how you see yourself and what you believe you can do. And if you are a man watching this, I hope these stories challenge you to question what you were taught about gender, about power, about who gets to make history and who gets to be remembered. I hope the next time you encounter a powerful woman in history, in politics, in your workplace, in your life, you think about the patterns we discussed. The rhetoric of the unnatural woman, the multiplication of standards, the reduction to relationships, and I hope you refuse to participate in those patterns. I hope you demand better, more complex, more honest narratives about women's capabilities and women's lives. For all of us, regardless of gender, I hope these stories inspire a kind of healthy skepticism about official narratives, about what we are told is true and important and worth remembering. I hope you start asking, who wrote this history? What did they leave out? Who benefited from that omission? These questions do not undermine history. They strengthen it. They make it more accurate, more inclusive, more honest about the complexity of the human past. The women we talked about tonight are finally being reclaimed. Their stories are being recovered, retold, taught, celebrated. But there are so many more, thousands more. Women whose names we do not even know, whose stories were never written down or were written down and lost, whose graves are unmarked, whose accomplishments were attributed to men, whose voices were silenced so thoroughly that we may never recover them. And that is a tragedy. That is a loss for all of us, because those stories could teach us, could inspire us, could change how we understand what humans are capable of. But the work continues. Every year, new discoveries are made, new sources are translated, new questions are asked, and slowly the historical record is being corrected. The women who disappeared are reappearing. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to change the narrative, enough to prove that women have always been here, always been powerful, always been essential to the story of humanity. Tonight we remembered Theodora, who rose from actress to empress and saved an empire. We remembered Matilda, who fought for 19 years for a throne that was rightfully hers. We remembered the Scottish queens who shaped a nation and were reduced to footnotes and nursery rhymes. We remembered Nsinga, who fought Portugal for 40 years and forced them to negotiate as equals. We remembered Amanirenas, who defeated Rome and has been forgotten for 2,000 years. We remembered Amina, whose walls still stand 500 years later, even though most people do not know her name. We remembered Wu Zetian, who was turned into a demon for being an effective ruler while female. We remembered the women who literally vanished, whose mysteries still haunt us. We remembered Isabella and Margaret, who were called she-wolves for daring to govern when their husbands could not. We remembered the empresses locked away in palaces of forgotten favourites, erased while still breathing, and we named the patterns that have kept all of these women from being remembered the way they should be. These women existed, they mattered, they shaped history, and they deserve to be remembered not as exceptions, not as anomalies, not as villains or victims or footnotes, but as what they were: powerful, complex, flawed, brilliant human beings who refused to accept the limitations placed on them, and who changed the world in ways that echo down to us today. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these women, for being willing to question what you were taught and to demand better narratives. I hope you carry these names with you. I hope you share these stories. I hope you keep asking who else is missing, what other voices have been silenced, and I hope you never again accept a history that pretends women were not there. The women who disappeared from history are disappearing no longer. We are bringing them back. We are saying their names. We are reclaiming their legacy. And that work is sacred, necessary, and ongoing. There are more stories to uncover, more women to remember, more patterns to expose and dismantle, and I cannot wait to share those stories with you. Until next time, sleep well, dream of empresses and warrior queens, and remember, history belongs to all of us, and it is never too late to reclaim the parts that were stolen.